The question has lingered like a drifting ember at the edge of humanity's collective memory, a whisper traced across clay tablets, echoed in ruined ziggurats, and carried through myths that refuse to die. Why did the Anunnaki, the radiant lords who shaped the early destinies of humankind, abandon the world they once called home? What force compelled them to forsake Nibiru, the wandering star that ancient scribes described not as a place of origin alone, but as a sanctuary of forgotten sovereignty? The old stories do not answer directly. They speak in symbols and shadows, in the careful language of a civilization terrified of remembering too much. Yet buried within those fragments lies the suggestion of a truth far older than any written record, a truth that hints at a cosmic fracture so devastating that even gods could not withstand its toll. Long before humanity carved its first boundary or forged its first blade, there existed a memory of celestial travelers whose arrival ignited the earliest dawns of knowledge. The civilizations that revered them did not portray them as distant abstractions, but as rulers who walked among rivers and mountains, shaping the rhythms of seasons and the laws of kingship. To the Sumerians, they were not myth. They were history, and at the center of that history was Nibiru, described as both a world and a throne, a realm whose cycles dictated eras of prosperity or collapse. Yet today, Nibiru is dismissed as superstition, relegated to the footnotes of speculative lore. Most never ask what might have driven such beings, if they existed, to abandon a world their myths treated with reverence approaching fear. Perhaps the greater mystery is not why they left Nibiru, but what they fled from. Each surviving tablet offers a clue, though never plainly. One speaks of a sky that dimmed unexpectedly. Another hints at internal conflicts among the celestial lords, conflicts so severe that even the stabilizing rituals of kingship could not mend them. Scholars debate these as metaphors, but metaphors do not inspire entire civilizations to reshape their cosmologies. Something happened. Something immense enough to fracture the memory of an era stretching beyond any measure we understand. The Anunnaki, depicted as near-immortal beings whose lifespans transcended human ages, would not abandon their home without the weight of desperation pressing behind them. And if Nibiru was more than a physical world, if it was a nexus of power, a repository of ancient energies, its loss would have signaled not merely relocation, but exile. It is this idea that draws modern seekers deeper into the enigma, because in every myth, every fragmented hymn, every omen scratched into clay by trembling hands, there is a resonance of something final, a departure etched with sorrow, with reluctance, with the silence of inevitability. And beneath that silence lies a haunting suggestion. The Anunnaki did not leave because they wanted to. They left because they had no choice. Yet if their home fell, why did they journey toward Earth? Why did they remain long enough to seed mythologies that survived thousands of years beyond their disappearance? Were we a refuge for them, or a responsibility they could not abandon? Or were we simply witnesses to the last flicker of a fading empire? These questions form the threshold of the story, casting long shadows across the ruins where their names still linger. The answer to why the Anunnaki abandoned Nibiru cannot be found in a single inscription, nor in any grand revelation. It must be reconstructed from the echoes of civilizations that struggled to capture even a fragment of what they witnessed. It must be pieced together from the ruins of ancient observatories, from the astronomical alignments that reflect a lost understanding of wandering stars, from symbols carved so precisely that they defy simple interpretation. But every pursuit of this lost truth begins in the same place. The moment Nibiru dimmed from the realm of the gods, leaving only silence in its wake. And as we step closer to that silence, we discover that it is not empty at all. It hums, faintly, with the memory of a departure that reshaped the destiny of two worlds. What could extinguish the light of a world once ruled by beings who claimed dominion over the heavens themselves? And if that light was lost forever, what fragments of its former brilliance still pulse beneath the surface of our own forgotten past? The path toward that answer begins now, in the shadow between what is known and what was deliberately concealed. As the first surviving whispers of an ancient catastrophe stir the dust of ages and beckon us deeper into the forgotten story of a world the gods could no longer call home. The silence left by Nibiru's fading presence lingers as a veil between epochs, and through that veil emerges the deeper premise of this forgotten chronicle. If the Anunnaki's departure from their home was not an act of choice, but a consequence of cosmic necessity, then the story that follows is not merely one of migration, it is one of unraveling power. The ancient scribes hint that the world the gods once inhabited was not a passive sphere drifting through the dark, but a living engine of cycles and forces that shaped their sovereignty. To understand why they abandoned it, we must trace the arc of their dependence on that wandering throne, and how its decline eroded the very foundation of their dominion. The premise begins with the relationship between the Anunnaki and the celestial rhythms that governed their extended lifespans, their perceived immortality, and the stability of their rule. In the oldest myths, longevity is tied not simply to divine biology, but to the orbital path of their world, a path described as elongated, unpredictable, and capable of bringing eras of abundance or devastation. Nibiru's cycle, therefore, was more than astronomical. It was existential. As we move deeper into their narrative, the central figures of this ancient drama begin to emerge from the twilight of memory. Some traditions present them as a council of divine rulers, each presiding over domains that mirrored both natural forces and societal structures. Others describe them as a hierarchy of advanced beings whose authority rested not only in ritual but in knowledge that early humanity could barely comprehend. At their apex stood a lineage of sovereigns whose task was to maintain balance between their world's shifting energies and the civilizations they fostered across cosmic boundaries. It is here that the premise sharpens. The fall of Nibiru was inseparable from the weakening of this ruling order, for the Anunnaki did not simply lose a home. They lost the stabilizing heart of their empire. Among these figures, one stands out in both reverence and dread across the oldest hymns. A ruler whose wisdom was believed to rival the cycles of time themselves, yet whose burden grew heavier as Nibiru's vitality waned. The tablets speak of this being not as a tyrant, but as a guardian, tasked with preserving the alignment between their world and the greater celestial architecture. When that alignment faltered, when the energies that once flowed freely became unstable, it was this figure who first perceived the approaching calamity. But even with that knowledge, the myths suggest a profound reluctance to abandon the realm that had shaped their identity. Their sovereignty was woven into Nibiru's existence. Leaving it meant severing ties to the source of their generational memory. Still, the symptoms of decline grew impossible to ignore. Fragmentary accounts speak of storms of unusual brilliance sweeping across the sky, of magnetic fields twisting like wounded serpents, of celestial markers shifting in ways that foretold the collapse of an era. If the Anunnaki relied on the cyclical rejuvenation granted by their world's orbit, then any disruption in that cycle threatened more than their comfort. It threatened their longevity, their power, and perhaps their survival. This is the contradiction that underpins the narrative. Beings revered as eternal, beings who guided humanity through its earliest awakenings, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to forces they could not fully control. The cracks in their dominion widened as Nibiru drifted toward instability, and with each passing age, the burden of sustaining their realm grew heavier. Yet even as their home faltered, the Anunnaki did not retreat immediately. The myths depict a long period of debate and uncertainty, a time when their council weighed the consequences of abandoning a world that had defined them. To leave Nibiru was to step into the unknown, to seek continuity elsewhere. perhaps even to cultivate life in worlds not shaped by their origin. In this way, Earth emerges not merely as a destination, but as a reluctant inheritance. The earliest civilizations remembered the arrival of radiant beings who descended with knowledge of agriculture, architecture, and celestial law. They remembered the forging of kingship, the mapping of constellations, and the introduction of rituals that mirrored patterns far older than any terrestrial tradition. These memories were not framed as beginnings, but as continuations, as though the Anunnaki were transplanting fragments of a dying world into the fertile cradle of a younger one. Still, there remains an anomaly that invites deeper inquiry. If the Anunnaki left Nibiru because they had no choice, why did they not later return? Why did their presence on Earth diminish until only myth preserved their names? Some would argue that once their home fell into decay, the beings who fled became untethered from the cycles that sustained them. Others suggest that internal conflicts erupted as the stress of survival mounted, conflicts that fractured their unity and scattered their legacy. The myths hint at dissent within their ranks, at disagreements over how to preserve their knowledge and whether humanity should be entrusted with the remnants of their fading empire. Such fractures might explain why some ancient traditions speak of benevolent gods, while others warn of lords who demanded obedience or extraction. They were not a monolith. They were a divided people, navigating the twilight of their sovereignty. This tension deepens the mystery. As Nibiru's decline accelerated, the Anunnaki faced the greatest contradiction of their existence. Beings once perceived as unchanging were forced into adaptation, exile, and reinvention. The moment their world could no longer sustain them marked the beginning of a vast dispersion, a scattering of knowledge that would later resurface in the myths of distant cultures. What remains unclear is whether they foresaw the final collapse of their realm or whether its end came more swiftly than they could endure. The surviving accounts are careful, almost hesitant, as though the scribes feared that naming the catastrophe too clearly would awaken memories best left buried. It is toward this looming fracture that the narrative now bends, drawing us toward the first profound anomaly in the story of the gods. For as we turn to the earliest descriptions of Nibiru's instability, we discover that its decline did not begin in isolation. It coincided with a cosmic shift whose implications reach far beyond the boundaries of myth, hinting at a transformation that reshaped not just a world, but an entire epoch. And as that transformation unfolds, the first definitive clue to why the Anunnaki abandoned their celestial home begins to emerge from the dust of forgotten ages. The anomaly that shadowed Nibiru's decline becomes clearer when we step into the world as it was remembered by those who lived beneath the early skies of Mesopotamia. They described a landscape shaped not only by rivers and fertile plains, but by the presence of beings whose arrival seemed to reorder the rhythm of nature itself. The cradle of humanity was a mosaic of settlements, canals, and temples rising from the dust. Yet beneath its familiar features lay echoes of an older world transplanted from elsewhere. To understand why the Anunnaki abandoned Nibiru, we must dwell for a moment within this transplanted echo and see how Earth became more than refuge. It became a mirror of a vanished realm. The myths carry an almost architectural precision when they speak of the cities the gods established. They were laid out according to celestial patterns, aligned with stars that no longer occupy the same positions, suggesting they commemorated something distant and lost, a design they carried with them through exile. The world they built among early humans was one of staggering contrast. On one hand, it bore the simplicity of agrarian life, shaped by seasons and watercourses. On the other, it was infused with symbols of knowledge, too ancient to have originated in the newly risen cities of clay and reed. The Sumerians remembered Enki shaping canals as though recalling the waterways of a forgotten home. They remembered Enlil presiding from elevated sanctuaries, as if replicating summit temples from a world where mountains or artificial spires rose toward a sky lit differently from our own. The rituals describing the descent of the gods read like reenactments of events whose origin was not terrestrial. This sense of replication, of rebuilding fragments of a lost reality, suggests that the Anunnaki were not simply adapting to Earth, but were preserving memories of their fading world through architecture, myth, and governance. The landscape they altered reflected more than nostalgia. It reflected the urgency of a people aware that their home's decline was accelerating. If Nibiru had once granted longevity through its celestial cycles, the Anunnaki may have sought ways to stabilize themselves upon Earth, embedding harmonics of their former realm into temples and observatories. Some myths speak of me, tablets or codes that held the essence of civilization. Others describe sacred precincts where the boundaries between Earth and the realm of the gods felt thin, as though those locations were engineered to maintain a connection to a source no longer fully accessible. It is in these echoes that we find hints of their desperation. The world they left behind was not merely collapsing, it was slipping beyond the reach of their influence. Yet Earth was not a perfect substitute. The climate, gravity, and cycles differed enough to strain their adapted lifespans. The myths mention eras of discord, sickness among the gods, and the need for renewal rituals that did not exist in earlier epochs. These references imply that life on Earth, while viable, imposed a cost on beings accustomed to the stabilizing energies of Nibiru. The decline of their home had created a fracture in their biological and spiritual equilibrium, and this fracture manifested as tension in the cities they ruled. They built ziggurats that rose like stairways to a sky no longer aligned with their ancestral markers. They established laws that echoed cosmic patterns no longer sustained by the cycles of their world. The cracks in their adaptation widened slowly, like fault lines beneath a city whose foundation was laid upon shifting ground. Still, early Earth admired them. The humans who tilled fields and offered tribute saw the Anunnaki as radiant and powerful, not recognizing the strain beneath their luminous veneer. The gods participated in ceremonies meant to reaffirm their sovereignty, but the oldest hymns occasionally slip into tones of lament, suggesting that even then the Anunnaki felt the weight of their exile. Some accounts depict moments when the gods gazed toward the horizon as if watching for a sign from the world that had nurtured them. But Nibiru, whose cycle once returned like a heartbeat, began to falter in the heavens. Its appearances grew irregular, its brilliance dimming across generations, leaving priests and scholars uncertain of its future path. The celestial throne was drifting, both physically and symbolically, farther from the reach of those who once ruled it. This growing uncertainty infused their world with a quiet unease. The Anunnaki, while still revered as divine, experienced a subtle erosion of authority. The long nights of watching a sky that no longer followed familiar rhythms weighed upon them, and their decisions became tinged with urgency. They increased their influence over agriculture and city planning, as though trying to impose stability on a world whose cycles they could not entirely master. Yet, unlike Nibiru, Earth was a realm of fluctuations, of seasonal unpredictability, of rivers that rose and receded with stubborn independence. Their attempts to replicate the harmony of their lost world were admirable but imperfect, and each failure reminded them that they were no longer sovereigns of a self-sustaining throne. They had become guardians of an outpost, scattered across the newly awakened civilizations of Earth. Despite these struggles, their presence shaped the rise of human culture in profound ways. The languages, laws, and myths that civilizations carried for millennia bear the imprint of knowledge that emerged not from terrestrial trial and error, but from a memory transplanted from a distant and dying world. The Anunnaki's teachings on irrigation, astronomy, metallurgy, and governance reflect a civilization far older than any known on Earth. Their influence suggests they intended to forge continuity, to ensure that even if Nibiru fell beyond recovery, something of its essence would survive. But beneath this noble endeavor lay the first hints of irreversible decline. For the more they built on Earth, the more they realized how much they had lost and how precarious their existence had become without the stabilizing cycle of their ancestral star. It is here, in this fragile balance between preservation and loss, that the first true anomaly emerges. The sense that the Anunnaki were preparing for a future they feared they might not witness. Their temples became repositories of knowledge too vast for early humanity alone. Their rituals grew complex, echoing mechanisms designed to anchor fading power. Everything they did seemed to anticipate an event looming just beyond the horizon, an event tied not to Earth, but to the final unraveling of the world they once called home. And as that unraveling approached, the cracks in their realm widened into a rift that no temple, no ritual, no memory could mend. The widening rift that shadowed the Anunnaki's existence deepened into something unmistakable, a contradiction that neither their rituals nor their authority could conceal. For while they labored to preserve the memory of their fading world through the cities and temples of Earth, the heavens began to whisper a truth they had long feared. Nibiru's cycle, once predictable with the elegance of a cosmic pendulum, had become erratic. The celestial markers that guided their calendars no longer aligned with the expectations of their astronomer priests. Stars that once heralded the return of their ancestral world drifted into unfamiliar positions. Seasons stretched or contracted with unsettling irregularity. At first, these anomalies were dismissed as temporary disturbances, the kind of astral turbulence that occasionally ripples across the firmament. But over generations, the shifts accumulated into a pattern too stark to ignore. Something had changed in the mechanics of their world's orbit, something catastrophic enough to alter the fate of a civilization. This contradiction struck at the heart of their existence. In the mythology surrounding the Anunnaki, Nibiru is not merely a celestial object, but a cornerstone of cosmological order. Its passage regulates epochs, its proximity nourishes vitality, its distance shapes eras of dormancy. But if those rhythms faltered, the implications rippled far beyond astronomical inconvenience. Their longevity, their stability, the very continuity of their lineage depended on the cyclical restoration granted by their home's return. When Nibiru weakened, so too did the beings who had derived strength from its presence. The myths, when read carefully, reveal an unspoken fear that crept into the hearts of the gods. They grew restless. They argued. They issued decrees that contradicted earlier laws, revealing fractures within their once unified council. And beneath their composure flickered something the humans around them could not name: the dread of extinction. It is in this context that the fragments of their oldest administrative texts become haunting in their precision. The surviving pieces speak of strange atmospheric disturbances, of calculations repeated obsessively by priest scholars who sought patterns where none remained. Clay tablets record celestial observations layered with anxiety, describing a dimming star, a distortion in trajectories, a celestial corridor that had begun to collapse. Though these records are often interpreted as poetic exaggerations, their consistency across regions suggests a shared experience of cosmic instability. The scribes noted that the gods grew withdrawn during these periods, convening in private chambers where debates raged about the future of their realm. Some advocated returning to Nibiru in hopes of repairing the imbalance. Others warned that the world was already too unstable to sustain their return. The contradiction in their deliberations mirrored the contradiction in their fading sky. The need to preserve a world that was slipping beyond recovery. Yet the world of humans saw only fragments of these struggles. Ordinary people witnessed omens, unusual eclipses, and seasons of abundance abruptly followed by years of drought. They attributed these events to divine displeasure or shifting cosmic will, unaware that they mirrored the larger crisis unfolding within the Anunnaki's ancestral sphere. Priests attempted to compensate through intensified rituals, sacrifices, and recalibrated calendars, but none of it restored the harmony of earlier ages. The gods' presence, once steady and luminous, became punctuated by absences and abrupt appearances, as though they were being pulled between worlds with increasing instability. Some myths describe the gods as weary, a word rarely associated with immortal beings. Others speak of their voices growing distant, as if stretched across a gulf widening with each passing cycle. This distance manifested not only physically, but politically. Rivalries that had once been manageable sparked into open conflict. Factions emerged within the divine council, each proposing different solutions to Nibiru's decline. The myths recalled disputes over succession, territory, and the future of humanity's role within their diminishing influence. These conflicts were symptoms of a greater fracture, the dawning realization that their dominion was no longer secured by the eternal cycles they had relied upon. For the first time in their long history, they were forced to confront the possibility that their vitality, once thought inexhaustible, depended on a world that could no longer sustain them. The contradictions grew sharper. They claimed dominion over heaven and earth, yet could not command the fate of their own celestial home. They proclaimed themselves eternal, yet the trembling of Nibiru's cycle revealed their mortality. Earth, with its abundant resources and youthful stability, offered them refuge, but not resolution. As Nibiru's appearances waned, the rituals connecting them to their ancestral star grew increasingly symbolic, lacking the power they once carried. The gods compensated through greater involvement in human affairs, perhaps hoping to fortify themselves through the civilizations they shaped. They established new centers of power, drafted codes of law, and expanded the complexity of their religious institutions. But beneath these accomplishments simmered an unspoken truth. They were no longer sustaining humanity. Humanity was sustaining them. This inversion unsettled them deeply. Their authority, once rooted in cosmic cycles and near immortal presence, increasingly depended on how well they could preserve the illusion of unbroken dominion. The contradiction reached its zenith when Nibiru, expected to return in a predicted cycle, failed to appear. The sky remained unchanged. The stars offered no sign. The scribes wrote of confusion rippling through the temples. The priests recalculated, searched for hidden alignments, and questioned whether they had misunderstood ancient formulas. But the truth, whispered in the chambers of the gods, was far more devastating. Nibiru's orbit had destabilized beyond their control. Its return had become uncertain. Its energy had begun to dissipate. The source of their rejuvenation, their authority, their very identity, was fading into cosmic obscurity. This absence shattered the equilibrium that had sustained them for ages. The gods, once united in purpose, now faced a schism that no ritual could mend. Some sought to cling to the fading remnants of their ancestral power, while others believed the only path forward lay in severing their dependence on Nibiru. The early myths that speak of exile, rebellion, or departure echo this fracture. Though encoded in symbolic language, they reveal a moment when the Anunnaki confronted the harsh reality that their world, once vibrant, once sovereign, was dying. And with that realization came the first irreversible step toward the great abandonment. The suspense that now looms over their story grows heavier, for the next question emerges with haunting clarity. If Nibiru's instability forced the gods to flee, what cataclysm finally made their return impossible? The answer lies deeper within the cosmic fractures that followed, fractures that would not only seal the fate of the gods, but reshape the destiny of Earth itself. The fracture left by Nibiru's disappearance did more than unsettle the political and celestial order of the Anunnaki. It triggered a deeper unraveling, one that reached into the mythic foundations of their identity. For in the oldest stories, long before the Sumerians etched cuneiform into damp clay, The Anunnaki were not simply rulers or travelers. They were embodiments of a cosmology far more intricate than later ages understood. Their hierarchy mirrored the structure of the universe as they believed it to exist, a ladder extending from the terrestrial world to realms unseen. Every deity represented a force or principle, not merely as a symbol, but as an active participant in maintaining harmony across dimensions. When Nibiru faltered, that harmony faltered with it, and the cosmology that had sustained them for ages trembled, as if struck by a distant quake whose origin lay beyond mortal comprehension. In this mythic architecture, the heavens were divided into layers, each governed by specific lords whose roles reflected the cycles of creation, destruction, and renewal. These layers were not metaphors for spiritual realms, but descriptions of energetic domains that the gods believed were as tangible as rivers or mountains. The Anunnaki saw themselves as the custodians of these domains, tasked with regulating the flow of life and order throughout the cosmos. Their rituals reenacted battles fought not with weapons but with harmonics, resonances, and alignments that shaped the equilibrium of existence. Even the architecture of their temples on Earth reflects this belief, with terraces symbolizing steps between worlds and sanctuaries designed to channel what they called the breath of the heavens. Their mythology was not ornamental, it was functional, a map for navigating the unseen forces that sustained their power. Central to this cosmic structure was the belief that every realm required a source of stability, a heart that pulsed with the energy of creation. For the Anunnaki, Nibiru served as that heart. It was not merely a home, but an anchor tying their cosmology to a fixed point in the cycles of the universe. When its orbit became erratic, the gods interpreted the disruption not simply as a physical anomaly, but as a sign that the cosmic order itself was shifting. The hymns from the era of decline speak of a trembling sky, of pillars shaking in the house of destiny, of a river of radiance that once connected worlds growing thin and brittle. These verses hint that their mythology had always contained a warning. If the anchor weakened, the realms it supported would feel the strain. And as Nibiru drifted into instability, the realms began to tilt. This belief shaped how the Anunnaki viewed their role among humans. They did not see themselves solely as rulers, but as intermediaries between Earth and the higher layers of the cosmos. Their presence was meant to maintain balance, ensuring that the flow of life, knowledge, and energy remained steady. When they introduced agriculture, astronomy, writing, and law, they did so not merely to advance civilization, but to weave humanity into a cosmic framework. The myths describing humans being molded from clay are not literal accounts, but metaphors for integrating terrestrial beings into a larger design. Humanity was crafted to participate in a system far older than Earth itself, a system threatened by Nibiru's decline. The rituals imposed upon early societies, offerings, festivals, recitations, were mechanisms meant to generate resonance, harmonizing Earth with the fading rhythm of their ancestral world. Yet beneath the grandeur of this cosmology lurked an unmistakable anxiety. The gods knew their power was intertwined with the stability of their mythic structure. As long as Nibiru remained strong, the layers of the cosmos stayed aligned, and the gods remained radiant. But as the celestial heart faltered, the myths took on a tone of urgency, as though the gods sensed an impending collapse of the very framework that defined them. Some traditions speak of divine councils debating the fate of the universe, of gods questioning whether the cycles of creation had entered a new phase beyond their control. Others hint at forbidden knowledge, secrets whispered only in the inner sanctums of their temples concerning the origins of their world and the possibility that what had once been created could also be unmade. This fear seeped into the cosmological structure itself. Myths that once celebrated eternal return began to speak of finality. Songs dedicated to the renewal of ages carried undertones of lament. Even the imagery of their divine hierarchy shifted, emphasizing vulnerability where once there had been unshakable authority. The great cosmic serpent, once a symbol of cyclical rebirth, became associated with encroaching chaos. The heavenly tablets, once believed to contain the laws of order, were described as dimming or losing their inscriptions. These changes suggest that the Anunnaki were not merely reacting to astronomical shifts, but were grappling with a deeper dread that the universe they had long understood was entering a phase that rendered their knowledge incomplete. This dread intensified as they realized that their cosmology depended on stability they could no longer guarantee. To uphold their hierarchy, they performed rituals meant to reinforce the bonds between realms, but each attempt revealed the weakening strands of the cosmic web. They consulted ancient oracles, questioned the wisdom of predecessors, and searched for patterns in the drifting stars. Humans observed only the outer shell of these efforts: heightened ceremonies, stricter laws, more elaborate temple rites. But beneath these actions lay a desperate attempt to mend a cosmology unraveling at its anchor. When the gods stood atop their ziggurats and gazed into the night, they were not watching over their subjects. They were searching for the light of a world that once sustained them, a world now dimming like an ember nearly consumed by darkness. This is the first true intersection where myth and catastrophe converge. The collapse of Nibiru's orbit was not only a physical disaster, it was a metaphysical one. The gods' entire worldview, their hierarchy, their identity as custodians of cosmic order, depended on the rhythms of a realm slipping beyond recovery. Their mythology, once a celebration of harmony, transformed into a struggle for preservation. And as the next turning point approached, the rituals of the gods began to shift from maintaining order to preparing for a cosmic rupture they feared they could not escape. It is toward this rupture that the story now bends, drawing us deeper into the twilight of a cosmology on the brink of transformation. The twilight of their cosmology ushered in a new and unsettling age, one in which the Anunnaki could no longer rely on the elegant symmetry that had defined their existence. As Nibiru drifted into instability, the gods confronted an urgent and unavoidable truth. The time of effortless dominion was ending, and it was in this crucible of uncertainty that the rise of civilization on Earth accelerated with astonishing speed, as though the gods, sensing the fragility of their own future, poured their remaining strength into shaping a world that might endure beyond them. The earliest cities of Mesopotamia did not emerge gradually, as one might expect from fledgling human societies. They appeared with architectural precision, agricultural sophistication, and astronomical insight that seemed disproportionate to their age. This sudden flowering of culture has long puzzled scholars, but within the narrative of the Anunnaki's decline, it becomes hauntingly coherent. The gods were transferring knowledge at a pace reflecting their fear that time itself was slipping away. The innovations attributed to them were not random. They formed an infrastructure of survival. Irrigation systems transformed barren plains into fields capable of sustaining great populations, echoing techniques the gods once used to regulate water on their ancestral world. The invention of writing crystallized memory, ensuring that their decrees and histories would persist even if their presence faded. Metallurgy advanced with startling precision, suggesting that the Anunnaki believed Earth might one day need tools far beyond simple agriculture. Even the structure of kingship, introduced as a divine mandate, served a purpose: to instill stability in a world that would soon be tested by forces inherited from the gods' own looming catastrophe. These developments were not merely gifts, they were safeguards. Yet as human civilization rose, the gods grew increasingly divided. Some believed that empowering humanity was essential, that humans could become custodians of knowledge the Anunnaki feared they might lose. Others resisted, arguing that teaching too much would grant humans access to powers they were never meant to wield. These tensions manifested in myths describing rivalries between gods, conflicts over cities, and disputes over humanity's role in the divine order. Each story, when stripped of metaphor, reveals a portrait of beings grappling with the collapse of certainty. The gods were not all-knowing. They were adapting to an unprecedented crisis, uncertain whether salvation lay in clinging to the remnants of their fading world or embracing the new civilization unfolding around them. Amid this uncertainty, Earth's cities transformed into laboratories of preservation. Temples became centers of both worship and experimentation, where the gods sought to adapt their knowledge to a realm whose physics differed subtly from their own. They studied Earth's magnetic fields, its rhythms, its mineral sources, searching for ways to replicate the harmonics they had relied upon in Nibiru's stabilizing cycle. The ziggurats, often interpreted as mere religious structures, may have served as energetic conduits, attempts to bridge the gap between two worlds now drifting apart. The gods deployed advanced instruments disguised as ritual objects, using them to measure the shifting patterns in the sky and to test whether Earth could sustain the kinds of renewal once granted by their distant home. But the results were mixed, their experiments often producing only partial success. Earth, vibrant and rich in life, lacked the precise configuration their bodies and technology required. As their efforts intensified, so too did the visible cracks among the divine. The myths speak of gods withdrawing to remote regions, of factions forming around competing visions of the future, of disputes severe enough to alter the fate of entire cities. The Sumerians recorded these divisions with remarkable candor, preserving tales of storms, battles, and decrees that reshaped the map of early civilization. These conflicts were not mere power struggles. They were the outward expression of an existential crisis. The Anunnaki had long been united by the stability of their world, but with Nibiru's decline, the bond weakened. Some gods oriented themselves toward Earth, viewing it as a potential new center of their civilization. Others remained fixated on their ancestral realm, refusing to abandon hope that it might yet be restored. And beneath these differing visions lay a deeper rift, whether their identity could survive the loss of the cycles that had defined them for ages. Humanity, caught in the crosswinds of divine uncertainty, became both witness and participant in this unfolding drama. The gods demanded loyalty, labor, and reverence, yet they also bestowed knowledge that elevated human society to unprecedented complexity. This duality, control and empowerment, reflected the gods' conflicting motives. Some viewed humans as indispensable partners in preserving fragments of their dying cosmology. Others saw them as tools to reinforce authority slipping through their grasp. The myths that portray gods teaching humans to build cities or cultivate crops often sit beside darker stories of divine wrath, suggesting a world where the gods' emotional and political volatility seeped into the human realm. The rise of civilization, far from being insulated from divine turmoil, evolved directly in response to it. Despite the tensions, one constant remained. The gods continued to watch the sky. Their astronomer priests monitored every shift, every irregularity, searching for signs that Nibiru might recover or that its instability might worsen. And as the cycles grew increasingly erratic, their sense of urgency deepened. Some texts describe frantic attempts to recalibrate sacred calendars, as though adjusting the measurement of time could postpone the inevitable. Others reference celestial omens interpreted as warnings, predicting an impending realignment that would challenge both gods and humans. Whether these predictions were literal or symbolic, they reveal a civilization profoundly aware of approaching upheaval. It is within this accelerating momentum that the seeds of the next great transformation began to take root. For the rise of early civilizations, magnificent as it was, could not mask the growing instability at the heart of the Anunnaki's existence. With each passing century, the gap between Earth's unfolding destiny and Nibiru's unraveling deepened. The gods, standing at the threshold of worlds, sensed the oncoming rupture long before humanity could comprehend its scale. And the decisions they made in this era, the alliances formed, the knowledge shared, the power centralized, would determine not only the fate of their cities, but the very survival of their legacy. As the story turns now toward the archaeological echoes they left behind, the question emerges with sharpened clarity. What remnants of this desperate age endure in the ruins beneath our feet? And what do those remnants reveal about the choices the gods made as their world slipped toward collapse? The answer lies buried within stones that still whisper of a time when divine hands shaped the foundations of civilization, even as their own celestial home drifted toward its final reckoning. The ruins that remain from that desperate era stand like fractured memories scattered across the spine of antiquity, silent yet insistent in what they attempt to reveal. Archaeology, in its cautious language, calls them temples, workshops, granaries, and ceremonial platforms. But within the context of a civilization guided by exiled gods, these structures transform into something far more intricate. Repositories of a fading cosmology, laboratories for the preservation of knowledge, and monuments built with an urgency few modern observers fully grasp. The cities of Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur rise from the dust not as isolated achievements, but as coordinated nodes in a network designed to anchor fragments of a dying world. Their alignment, their geometry, their symbolic motifs all hint at a unified purpose. As Nibiru slipped beyond recovery, the Anunnaki inscribed their memory into stone and clay, embedding clues that only now begin to surface with unsettling clarity. The archaeological body left behind by their occupation reveals patterns that defy the expectations of early human society. Structures appear with sudden complexity, as though designed from blueprints predating earthly culture. Stone foundations bear orientations aligned not merely with cardinal directions, but with celestial markers associated with Nibiru's former path, markers now lost to modern skies due to precession and the shifting fabric of time. Inscriptions, though etched in human script, contain layered meanings that cross-reference older, non-terrestrial systems of measurement. Even the earliest seals depict beings holding instruments that resemble advanced devices rather than ceremonial trinkets. These artifacts, often dismissed as symbolic, gain new significance when viewed through the lens of a civilization struggling to preserve coherence as its anchor drifted into oblivion. The gods were not simply ruling, they were documenting. Consider the tablets describing the construction of temples. They speak of foundations laid upon sacred measures, ratios so precise that slight deviations were believed to disrupt the flow of divine presence. These measures mirror proportions later found in monuments across distant cultures, suggesting that the Anunnaki disseminated architectural knowledge strategically, embedding cosmic harmonics into terrestrial structures. The precision of these buildings, often achieved with tools that should not have existed in early urban societies, implies the presence of advanced technologies now lost. Archaeologists note cut marks, drill holes, and polished surfaces inexplicable for a time predating metal saws. These anomalies gain coherence when viewed as remnants of a technological lineage inherited from a civilization whose world was dying. Earth became the canvas upon which the gods attempted to preserve their fading mastery of form, energy, and order. Yet the most compelling archaeological evidence lies not in grand structures but in small, intimate artifacts. Clay tablets, cylinder seals, and fragments of ritual items found deep beneath layers of collapse. Some tablets record astronomical data so precise it surpasses the capability of early instruments. Others contain references to cycles far longer than any human lifespan, implying that the scribes were recording knowledge passed down by beings who experienced time differently. Cylinder seals depict scenes of gods operating devices resembling star maps, compasses, or mechanisms for tracking celestial motion. These images, once dismissed as mythic embellishment, gain startling clarity when interpreted as documentation of tools the gods used to monitor Nibiru's deteriorating orbit. The seals are not mere symbols. They are memories in miniature, testimonies carved into stone of a world racing against cosmic decay. The material culture of the era also reveals a shift in the gods' priorities. Early artifacts emphasize power, abundance, and divine presence. But as centuries passed, a new theme emerged: preservation. Tablets detail rituals intended to maintain cosmic balance, hinting that the gods were attempting to compensate for the loss of Nibiru's stabilizing influence. Some records describe ceremonies involving the placement of objects at precise points within temple complexes, as though these items functioned as anchors or conduits. The presence of magnetic anomalies beneath certain ruins suggests that some of these artifacts may have been technological rather than ceremonial. The gods were embedding fragments of their world into Earth's architecture, hoping to recreate harmonics that could no longer be sourced from their fading celestial home. Excavations in ancient workshops reveal further traces of this adaptation. Tools found alongside unfinished artifacts suggest that the gods, or their human apprentices, attempted to replicate materials known from Nibiru, using Earth's minerals as substitutes. The chemical signatures of certain objects show alloys that should not have existed according to the known metallurgical capabilities of the time. These traces become poignant when viewed as efforts by exiled beings to rebuild what they had lost. Their world was dying, but they did not surrender to despair. They worked. They experimented. They shaped Earth into a mirror of their fading realm, hoping that resonance might buy them time. Yet the archaeological layers reveal that some experiments failed. Buildings show signs of sudden abandonment, tools left in place as though the workers vanished mid-task, and tablets break off mid-sentence, freezing in clay the anxiety of an impending collapse. The distribution of ruins across regions also reveals patterns of mobility among the gods. Some sites show cycles of intense occupation followed by abrupt withdrawal, suggesting that the Anunnaki moved strategically in response to changes in Nibiru's orbit. When their celestial heart flickered, they traveled to locations on Earth where its influence, however faint, could still be felt. These movements left behind layers of cultural and architectural fingerprints, each representing an attempt to maintain connection with a world slipping beyond reach. Over time, these attempts grew more desperate. Later layers show improvised construction, repurposed materials, and rushed workmanship, signs that the gods were losing both time and resources. Their once perfect symmetry gave way to asymmetry, revealing the stress of survival. Yet despite the desperation etched into these ruins, a powerful truth emerges. The gods did not abandon their mission. Even as their celestial throne decayed, they continued to preserve knowledge, encode messages, and guide humanity toward resilience. The artifacts they left behind are not remnants of fallen arrogance, but of enduring commitment. They reveal a civilization fighting to save something greater than itself. And within this struggle lies the next turning point in their story, for the archaeological evidence points toward a moment when the gods shifted from preservation to preparation, sensing that an irreversible catastrophe was approaching. As the next layer of the narrative unfolds, the question grows sharper. What administrative records survive that reveal the gods' strategies in those final centuries? And what do those records disclose about the choices that ultimately sealed the fate of Nibiru and their own? The administrative records that survive from the twilight of the Anunnaki's era carry a different tone from the monumental inscriptions that celebrated their dominion. These tablets, fragmentary, coded, often intentionally opaque, reveal the inner machinery of a civilization straining under the weight of cosmic decline. They do not speak in the lyrical reverence of hymns or the confident proclamations of royal decrees. Instead, they catalog shortages, disputes, recalibrations, and frantic attempts to impose order upon a world slipping beyond their control. If the ruins show us the physical imprint of their struggle, these administrative remnants reveal its psychological core. Through the careful lists, sealed correspondences, and clipped directives, we glimpse beings who once governed the rhythms of creation, now forced to confront logistical crises, dwindling resources, and a future they no longer fully commanded. Among the most telling records are detailed inventories of materials once abundant but suddenly scarce. They describe metals whose properties were essential to the gods' technology, minerals used to stabilize energetic fields, and organic compounds required for rituals that maintained their vitality. As Nibiru drifted into instability, the cosmic cycle that replenished these elements faltered. The gods turned to Earth for substitutes. Yet the administrative tablets show frustration. The terrestrial equivalents lacked the resonance of their celestial originals. Orders were issued for expeditions to distant lands, searching for deposits that might replicate the lost harmonics. Some missions returned empty-handed. Others returned with materials whose properties were promising but insufficient. Each failure tightened the pressure on the divine council, and the tablet's language begins to reflect urgency, even desperation. Correspondence between governing centers reveals growing tensions. Certain gods demanded priority access to dwindling resources, while others argued for rationing to preserve stability across all settlements. These disputes, encoded in formal terminology, mirror the political fractures widening at the heart of their hierarchy. The once unified council was unraveling into factions, each convinced their approach offered the best chance of survival. Administrative memos, record reallocations of labor, sometimes forcibly transferring human workers from one region to another, suggesting that the gods were consolidating their efforts in specific locations deemed more vital to their long-term strategies. These transfers are often associated with sites aligned to celestial markers, implying that the gods chose locations where the fading influence of Nibiru might still be measurable. Their strategies were not merely political, they were cosmological. Seals attached to these documents provide further insight. Many depict scenes of gods holding tablets inscribed with complex patterns, perhaps star charts or energy maps. Some show symbols resembling intertwined serpents, long interpreted as metaphors for duality, but which may indicate oscillating fields the gods were trying to stabilize. The recurring motif of a diminishing disk appears with increasing frequency, often accompanied by notations that suggest recalibration efforts. These symbols, once decorative, take on new meaning in the context of cosmic instability. They may represent attempts to quantify the weakening influence of their homeworld. The seals act as signatures not only of authority, but of ongoing experiments, as though each administrative decree was also a report on the shifting state of the cosmos. In the heart of the administrative archives are the tablets that once defined kingship. These do not merely outline the duties of rulers, they describe procedures for maintaining alignment between the earthly throne and the celestial seat of power, a seat now flickering. The rites of kingship, once ceremonial affirmations of cosmic order, became tools to compensate for the failing cycles of Nibiru. The gods adjusted the rituals, added steps, introduced new recitations, as though hoping to generate the resonance their world could no longer provide. Some records even describe temporary transfers of authority, with gods delegating responsibilities to human kings in ways previously unthinkable. This shift suggests that the gods were preparing for prolonged absences or diminished presence. anticipating a future in which their direct governance might no longer be possible. Kingship became less a symbol of divine mandate and more a mechanism of continuity. Among the most haunting administrative fragments are those dealing with chronology. Early records present time in cycles tied to Nibiru's orbit. But as the orbit destabilized, the calendars grew increasingly irregular. Scribes made notations acknowledging discrepancies, adding corrective measures, inserting intercalary periods, or proposing alternative systems of timekeeping based on earthly cycles. These adjustments reflect not only practical necessity, but existential fear. Time itself, once defined by the rhythms of their ancestral world, was slipping beyond their grasp. The gods debated new structures of chronology, and some records hint at disagreements over whether to continue acknowledging Nibiru's diminished cycle or to transition fully to Earth-based time. This dilemma was not merely administrative, it was symbolic, representing the tension between clinging to a fading identity and embracing a future unmoored from their celestial origin. The administrative evidence also reveals shifts in population management. Census tablets record fluctuations in human labor forces, suggesting that the gods were reorganizing society to support increasingly complex projects. These projects likely included attempts to recreate aspects of Nibiru's environment on Earth, constructing chambers, fields, and altars designed to simulate the energetic balance of their lost world. Some tablets list unusual allocations of grain, livestock, or manufactured goods to temples conducting advanced rituals. These resources may have supported experiments aimed at extending the gods' longevity or stabilizing their declining physiology. The meticulous accounting reflects the gravity of their situation. Nothing could be wasted, for every resource might contribute to their survival. Then there are the sealed directives, short, authoritative, and often cryptic. These orders frequently mention terms such as containment, realignment, and preservation, though their meanings remain debated. Taken together, they suggest strategic responses to emerging crises, possibly including natural disasters, energetic disruptions, or failures of infrastructure that once relied on Nibiru's steady influence. Some directives order the relocation of sacred objects, perhaps artifacts whose function depended on resonance with their homeworld. Others mandate the construction of new facilities aligned with specific celestial events. The language reveals a growing understanding among the gods. Their world was not simply weakening, it was approaching a threshold beyond which return might be impossible. And within these records lies a final thread, subtle yet profound. As the years passed, the administrative tablets increasingly reference a term translated variously as transition, departure, or threshold crossing. Its exact meaning remains elusive, but its context suggests preparation for a moment of irreversible change. Whether this transition referred to abandoning Nibiru, reshaping their governance on Earth, or confronting an impending cataclysm is unclear. Yet the steady rise of this term across administrative documents signals an awareness that the era of cyclical renewal had ended. A new epoch was coming, one defined not by return, but by severance. As these administrative remnants accumulate into a tapestry of decline, they point toward the next chapter in the god's story, the humanizing tension within the divine itself, as individuals among the Anunnaki struggled not only with cosmic collapse, but with their own inner fractures. For the records reveal strategy, but not emotion. To understand what truly drove the gods to abandon their home, we must now turn to the hearts behind the tablets, to the fears and hopes that shaped their final decisions as the shadow of irreversible loss grew ever nearer. The tablets preserve the strategies, but they do not capture the tremor beneath them. The private fears, the unspoken doubts, the fractures threading through the hearts of beings long considered unshakable. To understand why the Anunnaki ultimately abandoned Nibiru, we must step beyond the administrative records and enter the realm of their inner turmoil, where the divine became painfully human. for even gods, when pressed against the edge of extinction, reveal vulnerabilities that no decree or ritual can conceal. The myths that survive do not speak plainly of these emotions, yet their undertones are unmistakable. They present figures once cast in the glow of immortality, now burdened by uncertainty, frustration, and grief. The hymns dedicated to their greatness soften into elegies. The once unyielding proclamations of power begin to sound like pleas for equilibrium in a universe that no longer obeyed them. Through these shifting tones, a portrait emerges of beings wrestling not only with cosmic decline, but with the unraveling of their own identities. Among these figures were those who carried heavier burdens than others. Mythic traditions portray one ruler, sometimes as a wise strategist, sometimes as a weary monarch, whose role was to maintain balance between realms. In earlier ages, this being embodied the harmony of Nibiru's steady cycle, guiding both gods and humans with calm authority. But as the great orbit destabilized, so too did the foundation of this ruler's power. The myths depict long nights spent gazing at the heavens, watching for a light that grew dimmer with each passing century. They speak of decisions weighed in silence, of a ruler torn between loyalty to a dying world and responsibility to the colonies on Earth. The once commanding figure became haunted by the realization that even divine wisdom could not restore a cosmic heartbeat, fading into irretrievable darkness. This internal crisis, rarely acknowledged directly, shaped every decree issued in the twilight of their era. Other gods responded differently. Some recoiled into denial, insisting that Nibiru would recover if only they remained steadfast. They poured their energy into rituals that once channeled cosmic resonance, but now yielded diminishing returns. These beings are remembered in myths as stubborn, proud, or fierce, traits that in earlier epochs were celebrated, but in this era became symptoms of desperation. They clung to the belief that abandoning Nibiru would mean abandoning themselves, severing a lineage stretching back through epochs whose memory no human language could contain. Their refusal to accept decline intensified conflict within the council, forcing ancient loyalties to fracture under the weight of irreconcilable visions. These tensions echo in myths of sibling rivalries, warring factions, and divine judgments that reshaped entire civilizations. Beneath their symbolic veneer lie the emotional battle lines of beings confronting the erosion of their birthright. Yet not all were gripped by denial. Some gods recognized the signs of irreversible collapse sooner than others. They advocated for adaptation, urging the council to redirect resources toward Earth and to prepare for the possibility that Nibiru might never return. Myths portray these figures as innovators or rebels, their ideas disrupting traditional hierarchies. They encouraged greater collaboration with humanity, believing that survival might depend on forging new bonds rather than preserving old structures. Their influence can be seen in the sudden expansion of knowledge shared with humans, new techniques of agriculture, new principles of architecture, new systems of mathematics encoded with celestial logic. These gods viewed Earth not as a temporary refuge, but as a potential successor to Nibiru's legacy. But their openness created friction with conservative factions who feared that empowering humanity would dilute the divine hierarchy and hasten the dissolution of their identity. Caught between these poles was a silent majority, gods who felt the weight of collapse but lacked the clarity or courage to choose a path. Their uncertainty permeates myths describing divine withdrawal, periods when the gods retreated into sanctuaries or remote mountains to deliberate, reflect, or grieve. These stories are often framed as journeys or trials, but within them lies a quieter truth. They reflect the emotional paralysis of beings overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. Some myths speak of gods who wandered the earth disguised as mortals, seeking solace in human simplicity or observing the resilience of the species they helped cultivate. These wanderings hint at a growing recognition that humanity possessed something the gods did not: the capacity to adapt without the weight of cosmic inheritance. For the first time, the gods found themselves learning from the beings they once shaped, drawing strength from the very fragility they had once regarded as a flaw. As these emotional currents converged, the divine council became a crucible of conflicting desires, fears, and visions. Meetings, once marked by orderly deliberation, devolved into charged debates. Some gods argued that returning to Nibiru could restore their diminishing vitality. Others warned that such an attempt might be fatal. A few advocated severing all ties to their ancestral world, urging the council to embrace Earth fully and reshape their cosmology around its rhythms. These debates are echoed in myths of great assemblies, thunderous storms, and celestial battles. But beneath the dramatic imagery lies a truth far more intimate. The gods were struggling to reconcile who they had been with who they were becoming. Their immortality had always been conditional, sustained by a world whose collapse now forced them to confront their own finitude. Within this emotional storm, the humanizing details become even clearer. The gods expressed fear, not metaphorical fear symbolized in myths, but genuine uncertainty that rippled through their decisions. They experienced guilt for failing to preserve the world that had birthed them. Some grieved openly, mourning Nibiru as if mourning a dying parent. Others buried their sorrow beneath anger, projecting their frustration onto rival factions, human populations, or even the natural world. Their conflicts illuminated not only the political fractures within their hierarchy, but the emotional fragmentation at its core. These were not untouchable beings acting out predetermined destinies. They were exiles wrestling with the collapse of everything they knew, striving to find meaning as the universe shifted beneath their feet. And as the emotional tide rose, their interactions with humanity changed. The gods who embraced adaptation fostered deeper relationships with humans, teaching more openly, guiding more intimately, even forming bonds that blurred the boundaries between divine and mortal. The gods who clung to the past grew more distant, issuing decrees with the rigidity of beings terrified of losing control. These differing approaches shaped the myths, rituals, and cultural identities of early civilizations. They also set the stage for the next transformation, a moment when emotional fracture met cosmic catastrophe, and the gods were forced to confront the final truth of their world's fate. For as their hearts strained under the weight of loss, the heavens themselves prepared to deliver the blow that would shatter any remaining hope of saving Nibiru. The next chapter carries us toward that moment, when the emotional and cosmic crises converged into a single turning point from which there would be no return. The emotional fractures within the divine hierarchy formed only the surface of a deeper rupture, one that was about to cleave through the very foundation of their existence. As the debates intensified, as factions crystallized around visions of restoration or abandonment, a darker truth was emerging in the background, one that no amount of deliberation could soften. The cosmic symptoms that had long hinted at Nibiru's decline began to crescendo into unmistakable signs of catastrophe. The astronomer priests recorded anomalies with trembling styluses, irregular pulses of radiation, deviations in gravitational fields, distortions in the predictable movement of stars. These were not minor fluctuations. They were warnings, urgent and unrelenting, that the orbit of Nibiru was nearing a point of no return. And as these signs accumulated, the unresolved tensions within the divine council hardened into something more dangerous. Emotion, once a private burden carried quietly by the gods, became the fuel for decisions that would ripple across worlds. The turning point is preserved in fragments of myth that describe a gathering unlike any before it. The gods assembled not to issue decrees or celebrate cosmic cycles, but to confront the truth they had tried so desperately to evade. Even in its symbolic retelling, the scene carries the weight of finality. The ruler who had long served as the balance between worlds stood diminished, hollowed by sleepless ages of calculation. The innovators who had advocated adaptation pressed their case with renewed urgency, presenting data that revealed the magnitude of Nibiru's destabilization. The traditionalists, still clinging to visions of restoration, responded with fury, accusing their counterparts of treachery, cowardice, or betrayal of lineage. What had begun as ideological disagreement now erupted into open hostilities within the very chamber meant to maintain cosmic order. The myths speak of thunder in the council hall, but this thunder was not celestial. It was the sound of a civilization staring into the abyss of its own dissolution. While the gods argued, the heavens darkened with the shadow of impending collapse. The orbit that had sustained their longevity and authority had become a spiraling thread, fraying with every passing cycle. The astronomer priests, once confident in their mastery of celestial mechanics, documented anomalies that defied even their most advanced computations. Some records describe Nibiru's path dipping into regions of space, where gravitational forces amplified instability. Others speak of distortions in the energetic field surrounding the world, as though the cosmos itself were rejecting its continued passage. The signs were unmistakable. Nibiru was entering a phase of accelerated decay, one from which recovery appeared impossible. The gods who denied this reality did so out of fear, not ignorance. They could read the omens as clearly as their rivals, but accepting them meant accepting the end of their cosmic identity. As the truth grew inescapable, the emotional fractures within the divine council erupted into conflict that spilled beyond their hallowed chambers. Myths depict storms lashing the earth, cities trembling beneath invisible forces, and humans watching the skies with dread. These stories, while poetic, reflect real consequences of the gods' turmoil. Their powers, long controlled through harmony with Nibiru's cycles, grew unstable as the connection faltered. Energetic surges, once tempered by cosmic resonance, now spilled unpredictably into the environment. Temples that had served as stabilizing nodes flickered with erratic forces. Rituals meant to reinforce cosmic order backfired, producing effects that terrified even the gods who performed them. The emotional crisis had become a cosmological one, and humanity, caught in the crossfire, could only interpret the chaos as divine wrath. Within the council, a single question overshadowed all others. Could Nibiru be saved? The answer, though whispered by data and chiseled into every anomaly, remained too painful for some to accept. The traditionalists insisted that a return to their world might rekindle its fading energies, restoring equilibrium and reaffirming their dominion. But the innovators countered that such a return would be fatal, exposing the gods to forces their bodies were no longer equipped to endure. The ruler who had once guided them through eras of stability struggled to contain these arguments, torn between obligations to their ancestral home and responsibility for the lives under their protection. This internal crisis mirrored the cosmic crisis unfolding above. The fate of Nibiru had become intertwined with the fate of the god's identity, and no solution appeased both. Against this backdrop of turmoil, a radical idea emerged, one that would fracture the council irreparably. Some gods proposed a controlled abandonment of Nibiru, not merely as a temporary measure, but as a permanent severing of ties. If their world could not be saved, they argued, then the survival of their lineage required fully embracing Earth as their new center of existence. This proposal, shocking in its finality, ignited fury among those who still believed in restoration. Abandonment was tantamount to surrender, a betrayal of the cosmic heritage that had defined them across ages. Yet the facts grew more damning with each passing cycle. Nibiru's orbit had become chaotic, its trajectory unpredictable, its energetic fields collapsing. To return was to risk annihilation. Even the traditionalists began to falter, their certainty eroded by the unrelenting evidence of decline. The council reached a breaking point. A faction of gods, driven by desperation and devotion, prepared to undertake a final mission to Nibiru, believing they could stabilize it through direct intervention. They saw themselves as saviors, guardians of a legacy too sacred to abandon. But others, seeing the mission as suicide, refused to support it. The myths describe this moment as a schism marked by thunder and fire, but beneath the imagery lies a heartbreaking truth. The gods had ceased to be a unified force. They had become a civilization divided, torn between hope and realism, between heritage and survival. For the humans living beneath these celestial tensions, the signs were unmistakable. The gods' appearances grew sporadic. Their decrees became contradictory. Their temples, once centers of stability, became places of anxious activity. Priests whispered of omens too terrible to name. Crops failed under skies darkened by unfamiliar disturbances. Earth itself seemed to sense the distress of its celestial visitors, responding with quakes, storms, and strange atmospheric phenomena. Humanity watched helplessly as the beings they had revered for generations faltered under the weight of cosmic forces beyond comprehension. It was during one of these turbulent eras that the ruler of the Divine Council made a decision that would become the defining moment of their civilization's decline. After witnessing the catastrophic data gathered by astronomer priests and feeling the emotional fractures tearing their society apart, this ruler recognized a truth too stark to ignore. Nibiru had entered irreversible collapse. No ritual, no technology, no desperate mission could restore its stability. The world that had birthed them was dying, and clinging to it would doom them all. This realization did not bring relief. It brought anguish, sorrow, and a sense of failure that pierced even the immortal heart. The myths preserve this moment as a lamentation, a divine mourning that echoed across both heaven and earth. They speak of a ruler who wept not for their own fate, but for the world that had carried them through countless cycles of creation. Yet from this grief emerged clarity, a clarity that shaped the final era of the Anunnaki's presence on Earth. The ruler announced that the gods must prepare for a future without Nibiru, a future defined not by restoration, but by adaptation. This proclamation shocked the council, igniting new conflicts and deepening the fractures that had already formed. But it also marked the beginning of a shift, a pivot from denial to acceptance, from paralysis to action. And it is here, at this intersection of cosmic catastrophe and personal reckoning, that the tension climaxes. The gods, once secure in their celestial rhythm, now stood at the edge of an abyss. The next phase of their story would be shaped not by the crumbling orbit of their homeland, but by what they chose to build or sacrifice on the fragile world beneath their feet. For the cataclysm was coming, swift and unavoidable, and it would force every being, divine and mortal alike, to confront the end of an era. The moment of acceptance did not bring peace. It unleashed a new urgency that pulled the gods toward a path none had ever imagined, a quest beyond the boundaries of everything they had known. If Nibiru could no longer sustain them, then survival demanded exploration, experimentation, and journeys into regions of the cosmos previously considered inaccessible or forbidden. Myths later softened these undertakings into tales of heroic wanderings or cosmic pilgrimages, but beneath the poetic language lies the stark record of a civilization attempting to outrun extinction. The gods who once traversed worlds with effortless mastery now found themselves planning expeditions with caution bordering on fear, aware that the forces currently reshaping their homeworld might soon reach them as well. And so began the greatest journey in their history, not driven by curiosity or conquest, but by necessity, a quest for continuity in a universe collapsing behind them. Earth became their staging ground. From its mountains, deserts, and river valleys, the gods launched missions intended to probe the cosmic flux, destabilizing Nibiru. They repurposed temples into observatories, turning ziggurats into towering platforms from which they measured distortions in gravitational currents. They constructed devices from rare metals and unearthly alloys, embedding them in chambers aligned with stars no longer predictable. At night, humans watched as radiant chariots, described in later myths as boats of the sky, rose from mountaintops and vanished into the dark. These journeys were not symbolic. They were urgent reconnaissance missions aimed at mapping the unseen forces that threatened to erase their origin from existence. Each expedition carried fragments of hope, yet returned with data more dire than before. Nibiru's trajectory was unraveling at an accelerating rate, and its destabilization was influencing the surrounding vacuum in ways that defied even the gods' ancient knowledge. Some missions sought answers in the cosmic void, while others traveled to Earth's remote regions, searching for places where energies resonated faintly with what remained of their dying world. The myths that describe gods roaming deserts, crossing seas, or ascending mountains may reflect these efforts. They were not wandering aimlessly, they were hunting for anchor points, sites where remnants of Nibiru's harmonic field could be tracked, measured, or sustained. In high plateaus and volcanic ridges, they discovered anomalies, magnetic vortices, thermal pulses, and geometric distortions that hinted at deeper connections between Earth's energy grid and the cosmic lattice fraying under Nibiru's collapse. These discoveries ignited both excitement and dread. If Earth possessed the capacity to stabilize what remained of their power, then adaptation was possible. If not, the gods faced a slow fading into irrelevance, their long lifespans dwindling into fragile mortal limits. The gods' journeys grew more perilous as the cosmic fabric twisted under the strain of Nibiru's disintegration. Expeditions reported turbulence in regions of space once calm, distortions that bent light and time, pockets of silence where signals could not pass. Some missions did not return at all. Tablets reference "lost travelers," a phrase loaded with sorrow and fear, suggesting that even divine beings could be consumed by the cosmic upheaval. These losses weighed heavily on the Council. Each vanished expedition confirmed what many had refused to admit. The universe itself was changing in response to Nibiru's collapse, as though the fall of a celestial anchor had destabilized more than their own civilization. The gods' quest had expanded from the search for survival into a confrontation with forces capable of reshaping the architecture of reality. Yet amid the dangers, some expeditions brought back discoveries that fueled hope. One team returned with evidence that certain earthly locations, particularly those aligned with ancient fault lines or celestial pathways, amplified traces of resonance similar to the frequencies Nibiru once emitted. These sites became centers for frantic experimentation. The gods erected towering structures of stone, metal, and crystalline materials, attempting to simulate the energy cycles that had sustained their vitality. Humans assisted in these constructions, unaware that they were helping build prototypes of survival rather than monuments of worship. The myths that later portrayed these feats as gifts of divine knowledge obscure the truth. They were desperate attempts to recreate what had been lost. As the expeditions intensified, a new divide emerged within the gods' ranks. Some saw the journey as a chance to redefine their destiny, embracing the challenge of adapting to a universe no longer anchored by their ancestral world. Others grew increasingly bitter, accusing the innovators of abandoning Nibiru before its fate was sealed. This emotional fracture reached its apex when a faction attempted to launch a final mission back to their dying world, determined to salvage what little remained. The journey was fraught with danger, but they believed that direct intervention could halt the collapse or extract data crucial for long-term survival. Their departure was marked by both reverence and dread, as those left behind sensed that the mission represented not only a physical journey, but a symbolic confrontation with the end of an epoch. The expedition's return, scarred, diminished, and bearing catastrophic news, became the defining moment of the gods' collective psyche. They reported scenes beyond comprehension, storms of radiation tearing across the surface, gravitational distortions ripping through the crust, cities of their ancestors collapsing into molten fissures. Nibiru was not merely dying, it was undergoing a transformation so violent and absolute that no life, no memory, no fragment of civilization could survive its final convulsions. Their homeworld had entered its terminal phase, a cosmic death throe that would soon render it unrecognizable even to its creators. The mission's survivors brought back not hope, but the certainty that the universe had closed the door behind them. With this revelation, the gods' quest shifted from exploration to preparation. The emotional weight of finality settled upon them like a shroud. Some withdrew into contemplation, mourning the inevitable loss of their cosmic origin. Others threw themselves into their work with renewed intensity, determined to build a future on Earth before the decay of Nibiru's last energies stripped them of their remaining powers. Their journeys, once aimed at understanding, became missions of consolidation, gathering resources, knowledge, and artifacts to ensure continuity on a world that was never meant to become their permanent home. But beneath the urgency, a new question emerged, whispered only in the deepest chambers of their temples. If the collapse of Nibiru was so complete, what ripple would it send across Earth, the world now bearing the weight of their refuge? The answer would come soon enough in the form of an event so cataclysmic that even the gods, with all their foresight and ancient knowledge, could not fully prepare for it. This event would test the limits of their resilience, challenge their connection to humanity, and force them to confront a truth more devastating than the loss of their home world. For the universe was not finished with them, not yet. The revelation of Nibiru's terminal collapse thrust the gods into a new and harrowing chapter, one defined not by exploration or preparation alone, but by the emergence of a figure whose presence would alter the trajectory of their fading epoch, the Keeper of Secrets. Every civilization touched by the Anunnaki preserved some memory of this enigmatic being, sometimes as a sage, sometimes as a prophet, sometimes as a wanderer whose knowledge exceeded even that of the ruling council. Yet the myths agree on one point. This figure appeared when the gods stood at the brink of irreversible loss, carrying truths too dangerous or too painful for others to confront. Whether the keeper was one of the Anunnaki or an ancient survivor of an even older lineage has long been debated, but within the narrative of decline, their role becomes unmistakable. They emerged not to comfort or reassure, but to reveal what the others had refused to see, guiding them toward a truth that would reshape their destiny. The earliest references describe the keeper as a being who moved between worlds with an ease that seemed impossible during an era of cosmic instability. While other gods struggled to navigate the distortions created by Nibiru's dying orbit, the keeper traversed these hazards as though following pathways invisible to others. Some myths claim they possessed access to knowledge predating Nibiru itself, fragments of cosmic history long forgotten even by the Anunnaki. Others portray them as a custodian of forbidden wisdom, entrusted with archives sealed since the dawn of their civilization. In every version, the keeper stood apart, respected, feared, and rarely understood. When they finally stepped into the center of the gods' crisis, the council recognized that their arrival was not coincidence. It was inevitability. The meeting between the keeper and the ruling council is preserved in fragments across multiple cultures. Though each retelling differs in tone and symbolism, the core remains unchanged. The keeper arrived with warnings, carrying relics inscribed with patterns that destabilized even seasoned astronomer priests. They spoke of trajectories that could not be altered, of cosmic cycles drawing to their natural conclusion, of the risk not only to Nibiru, but to the balance of realms connected to it. Their voice, according to myth, resonated with both sorrow and conviction. They revealed that the collapse of Nibiru was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger shift in the cosmic architecture, one that would ripple across planets, stars, and dimensions that had long relied on the stabilizing presence of the Anunnaki's ancestral world. The gods, shaken by the catastrophic data returned by their expeditions, found themselves confronted with a truth even more profound. The universe was changing, and their civilization was not exempt from that change. While many in the council listened in stunned silence, others resisted the keeper's message. The traditionalists accused them of sowing despair, arguing that ancient prophecies promised renewal, not annihilation. But the keeper countered that prophecies were echoes of cycles misunderstood, misremembered, or idealized across countless ages. Nibiru had once been strong, but its strength had always been borrowed from a cosmic configuration now dissolving. The collapse was not a punishment, but a consequence, a natural conclusion to a cycle that no ritual or technology could reverse. For some gods, this explanation brought clarity. For others, it brought rage. The keeper's very presence forced them to acknowledge what they had long denied. Their identity as immortals had been predicated on conditions that no longer existed. Yet the keeper did not come simply to deliver grim truths. They brought knowledge, maps of energy flows, and schematics of structures that could stabilize the gods' diminishing resonance. These plans were unlike anything the Anunnaki had created on Earth, incorporating principles that seemed to bridge physical and metaphysical domains. The keeper instructed the council to disperse these designs across multiple regions, embedding them in temples, mountainsides, and even beneath oceans. These nodes, when activated, could preserve fragments of the gods' dwindling vitality and safeguard humanity against the environmental consequences of Nibiru's collapse. The council, moved less by trust than by desperation, agreed to follow the keeper's guidance. They recognized that their survival now depended on knowledge that exceeded even their extensive legacy. The keeper's teachings extended beyond architecture and mechanics. They spoke of consciousness, of the evolution of species, and of the need to transfer knowledge into forms that could endure long after the gods' physical manifestation faded. Some myths suggest that the keeper introduced the concept of divine essence dispersal, the idea that power could be encoded not in bodies, but in symbols, structures, or even in the minds of mortal beings capable of carrying wisdom forward. This radical notion challenged the gods' understanding of themselves, but as their powers waned, as Nibiru's resonance slipped further beyond reach, they recognized the necessity of transformation. Their role as rulers was ending. Their role as teachers, guides, and ancestors was beginning. The keeper's presence also exposed fractures within the council that had remained hidden even during peak crisis. Some gods viewed the teachings as liberation, an opportunity to transcend the limitations imposed by their dependence on Nibiru. Others saw them as betrayal, a surrender to forces they believed could still be resisted. One myth describes a confrontation in which the keeper warned that clinging to the past would doom not only the gods, but humanity as well. Another recounts a moment when the keeper presented a relic that projected the future trajectory of Nibiru, a path that ended in violent fragmentation. Upon seeing this, even the most stubborn traditionalists faltered, their denial collapsing under the weight of cosmic certainty. As the keeper guided the council through the final stages of preparation, humanity watched from below, sensing a shift in the nature of divine presence. The gods grew quieter, more contemplative, more burdened by the knowledge of what lay ahead. They engaged less in displays of power and more in transfers of knowledge, teaching writing, mathematics, and celestial understanding with renewed urgency. The myths of gods walking among humans during a final golden age reflect this era, a time when the divine, humbled by cosmic truth, connected with the mortal in ways never seen before. Yet the keeper's warnings carried one final revelation, one that unsettled even the bravest among the gods. Nibiru's collapse would not remain distant. Its energetic death throes would sweep across the regions of space Earth inhabited. The cataclysm would not destroy the planet, but it would unleash forces capable of reshaping continents, altering climates, and threatening the survival of early civilizations. This disaster, foretold in omens and recorded in stone across cultures, would become the defining crucible of both gods and humans. The keeper urged the council to prepare, not for escape, but for endurance. For what approached was not merely the end of a world, but the beginning of an age in which survival would require resilience, cooperation, and sacrifice. The gods, once accustomed to shaping destiny, now faced the unthinkable. They would soon stand not as rulers, but as guardians navigating a storm greater than anything they had ever known. And that storm, the great cataclysm born from Nibiru's dying orbit, was already gathering at the edge of the sky. The storm began as a whisper, an almost imperceptible tremor in the fabric of the sky, a subtle dimming in the constellations the gods had read for ages. At first, only the keeper and the astronomer priests sensed it, tracing faint irregularities in the heavens that ordinary eyes could not detect. But within a single generation, the whisper grew into a roar. The collapse of Nibiru, once a distant tragedy unfolding across the cold reaches of space, now pressed its shadow directly upon Earth. The dying world's gravitational convulsions distorted the cosmic lattice, sending waves of force rippling across dimensions. These waves moved like unseen tides, bending the auroras, warping magnetic fields, and accelerating geological pressures deep beneath the crust. The great cataclysm had begun, not in fire or darkness, but in the eerie electric stillness before the deluge. Humanity felt the first signs in their bones. Birds migrated erratically. Livestock grew restless. Water levels shifted in wells without rainfall. Priests trembled during rituals as temple stones vibrated beneath their feet, humming with frequencies never heard before. The gods watched from mountaintops and sanctuaries, their faces shadowed not by ignorance, but by recognition. This was the precursor to what the keeper had foretold. The resonance wave, a final echo from Nibiru's dying orbit, sweeping outward like a farewell from a world tearing itself apart. The traditionalists, who had clung to hope that their homeworld might yet be restored, now stood silent. The denial that had shielded them shattered as the sky brightened with unnatural hues, violet flickers, red spirals, and shimmering veils that stretched across continents. These were not omens. They were the fingerprints of cosmic trauma. The first true blow struck without warning. A resonant surge slammed against Earth's magnetosphere, compressing it with a force no astronomer priest had ever calculated. The skies erupted with storms that moved against prevailing winds, tearing across plains and engulfing cities with walls of sand, water, or ice. Lightning split into branching webs that crawled across entire horizons, illuminating terrified faces as day and night blended into a single chaotic interval. In the deep oceans, tectonic plates groaned, shifting under pressures that had no earthly origin. Waves rose higher than temple towers, crashing onto shores with a violence that erased entire settlements. These were not punishments. They were the physical consequences of a cosmic collapse reverberating through Earth's delicate equilibrium. The gods intervened where they could, but even their power, once effortless and commanding, strained against the magnitude of the cataclysm. They raised protective barriers around certain cities, diverting winds and calming waters through techniques inherited from their ancestral technologies. But such feats required resonance with energies that were rapidly fading. Each intervention cost them fragments of vitality they could not replenish. Humanity, witnessing the gods' struggle, experienced a revelation that shook the foundations of belief. The divine were not invincible. They bled, fatigued, and faltered. Some collapsed under the strain, their bodies unable to adapt to the shifting harmonics. Myths later transformed these moments into tales of gods returning to the heavens. But the truth was harder and far more poignant. They were being undone by the very forces that had once sustained them. The resonance wave intensified, triggering a sequence of disasters that unfolded like the verses of a prophecy written in the language of chaos. Mountains cracked open, releasing plumes of ash that turned the sky copper. Rivers reversed course. Fault lines awakened, carrying tremors across continents. A great darkness fell, not from celestial obstruction, but from layers of particulates thrown into the atmosphere, scattering sunlight and plunging the world into a cooling twilight. Humanity huddled in fear as the familiar world dissolved around them, guided only by the desperate instructions of gods, who now realized the limits of their intervention. The Keeper moved tirelessly between regions, stabilizing resonant nodes, preventing total collapse, and urging the gods to conserve their energy for what was still to come. For the wave they were experiencing was only the beginning. The most devastating moment arrived when the final fragment of Nibiru's orbit intersected with Earth's energetic field. This was not a physical collision, but a harmonic one, a moment when the frequencies of the dying world overlapped with terrestrial resonance, sending a shockwave through every layer of the planet. The ground heaved as if exhaling millennia of suppressed breath. Oceans surged in monstrous spirals. Storms coiled into vortices that rose from earth to sky. And in the midst of this upheaval, the gods felt a collective pain as their ancestral connections snapped. Whatever faint resonance had lingered between them and Nibiru vanished, leaving a void so deep that even their immortal minds reeled from its emptiness. Some myths describe this moment as the breaking of the sky, others as the night of endless thunder. But the truth beneath the symbolism is stark. This was the death cry of their homeland, rippling across the cosmos and severing the final thread that tied the gods to the world that shaped them. The emotional impact was cataclysmic. Even those who had accepted the inevitability of Nibiru's fall collapsed in grief. The traditionalists wailed, their denial finally yielding to heartbreak. The innovators, though braced for the reality, found themselves trembling beneath the weight of finality. And the Keeper, who had foreseen the collapse more clearly than any, bowed their head in sorrow, not because the event was unexpected, but because no amount of knowledge could dull the pain of witnessing the end of an origin. Human civilization suffered immeasurably in the aftermath. Entire regions vanished beneath water or sand. Others froze beneath ash-laden skies. Survivors clung to whatever structures the gods had fortified, trembling as aftershocks rippled across the land. Yet amid the devastation, a strange clarity emerged. Humanity realized that the world was not ending, only transforming, and the gods, weakened but still present, recognized that their role was shifting irrevocably. They were no longer celestial rulers descended from an eternal star. They were guardians of a fragile species, sharing in the vulnerability of a world now stripped of cosmic certainty. The cataclysm had revealed the final truth. Nibiru was gone, and the gods could never return. But in the ashes of loss lay an even deeper question, one that would define the next stage of their existence. With their origin extinguished and their power diminished, what future could they build on a planet reshaped by cosmic catastrophe? And in the quiet after the storm, another realization dawned. Some answers lay forever beyond reach, hidden behind the veil of a truth too vast even for the divine to grasp. The quiet that followed the cataclysm was not peace. It was the stunned, breathless stillness of a world attempting to remember itself after being torn apart. The survivors, human and divine alike, walked through landscapes transformed beyond recognition. Rivers had carved new paths through shattered earth. Forests lay flattened in spirals that traced the invisible fingerprints of the resonance wave. Mountain peaks glowed with residual energy discharged during the harmonic collision with Nibiru's dying orbit. And above it all, the sky hung strangely empty, void of the faint celestial pulse that had once tethered the gods to their origin. The absence was palpable, as though the universe itself had exhaled and removed from existence the final whisper of a world that had shaped epochs. It was within this silence that the greatest wound emerged, not in the land, but within the hearts of the Anunnaki, who now faced a truth they had never imagined. The revelation they sought had become unreachable. For generations, the gods had believed that understanding the cosmos meant understanding their place within it. Nibiru's orbit, though mysterious and perilous, had always been the key that unlocked their identity. Its cycles had defined their longevity, their authority, and their relationship to creation itself. But now, with the collapse complete and the final resonance wave past, even the most skilled among them found themselves staring into a cosmic void that offered no answers. Records they once consulted for clarity had become relics of a world that no longer existed. Instruments built to track the celestial harmonics of their homeworld now registered only noise, their readings meaningless, without the anchor that had given them purpose. The gods had sought revelation in the collapse, hoping that Nibiru's final moments might unveil some deeper cosmic truth. Instead, they found only silence. This failure to grasp the meaning of their own catastrophe tore through the council like a second cataclysm. Some gods turned inward, retreating into sanctuaries or wilderness, seeking isolation from the unbearable weight of loss. They meditated beneath stars that no longer carried familiar patterns, hoping to sense echoes of a realm now vanished. Others wandered the ruins of cities they had once protected, touching toppled stones as though the structures might whisper secrets of what had gone wrong. Their grief became cyclical, mirroring the orbit that had defined them. Only now the cycle led nowhere. Myths from this era speak of gods who wept underground, gods who screamed into canyons, gods who shattered their own symbols when they realized that their prophecies had been misread. These stories, though framed poetically, reflect the profound existential crisis overtaking beings who had once viewed themselves as intermediaries between worlds. The keeper, who had foreseen the collapse, became a figure both sought and shunned. Many gods approached them in desperation, demanding answers that no longer existed. Why had the cosmic cycles shifted? Why had the universe allowed the anchor of their civilization to die? What purpose could such destruction serve in a cosmos built upon rhythm and renewal? But the keeper, for all their wisdom, could not explain what lay beyond the veil of collapse. They admitted that some truths remained inaccessible even to them, that the final moments of Nibiru had occurred within a realm of cosmic mechanics no being could witness or comprehend. This admission shook the council more deeply than the cataclysm itself. If the keeper, long regarded as the bridge between known and unknown, could not decode the ultimate meaning of their world's death, then who could? As the days turned to months, and the months to years, the gods began to sense a second loss more subtle than the collapse of Nibiru, the gradual fading of their own resonance. Their powers, once an extension of their homeworld's harmonic cycle, no longer replenished naturally. Rituals that had sustained them for ages now produced only flickering results. The innovations crafted from the keeper's teachings still functioned, but with diminishing returns. Even structures designed to stabilize their energy fields could not replicate what they had once drawn effortlessly from the cosmos. The gods felt themselves growing heavier, slower, more susceptible to fatigue and emotion. They were not dying, but they were becoming something unfamiliar, less luminous, more anchored, more mortal. This transformation filled some with terror, others with curiosity, and still others with a quiet, growing acceptance. But beneath all reactions lay the deeper truth. Without Nibiru, their former selves were unreachable. Humanity, meanwhile, struggled to interpret the gods' diminishing presence. Some civilizations elevated the memory of divine intervention into new myths, believing the gods had sacrificed their power to preserve the world. Others viewed their fading clarity as abandonment. Across regions, stories diverged. Some claimed the gods were withdrawing to prepare for a final revelation. Others insisted they had lost control of cosmic forces and now wandered aimlessly. None grasped the full reality, that the gods themselves were searching for meaning amid the ruins of their cosmology, seeking answers that the universe refused to yield. Yet humanity's increasing independence, born from necessity during the cataclysm, carried an unintended consequence. The more humans adapted to the altered world, the more the gods realized that their role as rulers had ended. A new era was emerging, one that no longer required their daily intervention. This shifting dynamic intensified the gods' existential turmoil. They had attempted to bridge the gap between their fading world and Earth through knowledge, architecture, and guardianship. But the collapse had severed the path they meant to follow. The revelations they sought, the cosmic purpose behind the fall, the hidden laws governing cycles, the deeper meaning of existence, remained beyond their grasp. Some gods believed the answers were lost forever. Others held on to the fragile hope that remnants of truth still lingered, hidden in the patterns of Earth's transformed landscape. A few embarked on personal quests across mountains, deserts, and oceans, searching for fragments of resonance or messages encoded in geological scars. These journeys produced visions, dreams, and symbols later interpreted as divine teachings, yet the gods themselves knew they were not revelations. They were reflections of their own longing. The greatest wound, however, came from within. For the first time, the gods faced the possibility that some truths are not meant to be attained, that the universe contains mysteries so vast that even celestial beings cannot uncover them. This realization, subtle yet devastating, fractured their confidence in the order they had once upheld. They had believed in cycles, in cosmic symmetry, in the predictability of creation and destruction. But the collapse of Nibiru had defied these principles, leaving behind a universe that felt chaotic, indifferent, and impenetrable. The existential blow was not merely the loss of their world, but the shattering of the belief that existence was fully knowable. And so, the story reaches a threshold where even gods falter. The great cataclysm had stripped away certainty, identity, and origin, leaving only questions suspended in the silence of a transformed sky. The truth they had sought remained just beyond reach, like a star glimpsed through clouds, always present yet forever concealed. But in that vast, aching absence, a new possibility began to take shape, one born not from cosmic knowledge, but from the slow awakening of humility. For unanswered questions carry their own power, and in the void left by revelation denied, the gods unknowingly stepped into the first shadow of transformation that would lead them toward a new understanding of their place in the universe. The unanswered questions that loomed over the gods did not fade with time. They deepened, growing roots that twisted through every chamber of their fractured council. With Nibiru gone, the pantheon that had once embodied cosmic order now stood exposed, their hierarchy revealed as a structure built upon a foundation that no longer existed. Their titles, Lord of the Winds, Keeper of the Waters, Architect of the Sacred Measures, had once aligned with the natural forces emanating from their homeworld. But on Earth, those roles drifted into ambiguity. Some gods clung to their ancient identities, insisting that the pantheon remained immutable despite the collapse. Others recognized the truth whispered within the silence. Their essence had been shaped not only by will, but by the cosmic energies that once flowed through them. Without Nibiru, the pantheon itself began to unravel. This unraveling unfolded subtly at first. Gods who had once represented distinct domains felt their powers overlap or dissipate. The divine Lord of Storms found that Earth's atmosphere responded unpredictably, resisting manipulation as if the planet were shedding external influence. The goddess of fertility felt the rhythms of growth slipping beyond her grasp, replaced by terrestrial cycles indifferent to celestial authority. Even the keeper of knowledge sensed a veil descending between past and present, obscuring once clear memories of ancient epochs. These changes forced the gods to confront a possibility that had long lurked beneath the edge of myth. Their roles had not been purely inherent, but symbiotic. The pantheon had been a reflection of cosmic order, and with that order disrupted, the reflection distorted. The keeper of secrets, whose warnings had prepared them for many truths, acknowledged this shift with a gravity that unsettled even their closest allies. They explained that divine identity was never static. It evolved in harmony with the energetic environment that shaped consciousness itself. Nibiru had once provided a scaffolding that allowed the pantheon to maintain coherence, reinforcing their roles across millennia. Without that scaffolding, the gods were experiencing a dissolution of boundaries, a blurring of distinctions that forced them to re-examine who they were beyond their inherited titles. Some saw this as liberation, others as erasure. The debates that followed became heated, tracing fault lines that had been widening since the first signs of their homeworld's decline. The pantheon's structure, once a precise hierarchy built upon cosmic resonance, now fractured into clusters of shifting alliances. Traditionalists argued that the collapse was a test, a trial through which their eternal identities would be reaffirmed once they re-established order. They insisted on preserving rituals exactly as they had been performed on Nibiru, believing that repetition alone might restore lost harmonics. Innovators countered that the pantheon must adapt, embracing roles shaped by Earth's unique energies rather than clinging to the remnants of their past. They proposed redefining domains, combining powers, and even relinquishing titles that no longer held meaning. These divergent visions turned the council into a crucible of philosophical conflict, pushing each deity to examine the origins of their own divinity. In this era of deconstruction, myths later recorded the pantheon in terms of personality and emotion rather than cosmic function. The gods who once governed storms became symbols of grief or rage. The gods who ruled over water transformed into figures of healing or memory. These shifts were not arbitrary. They reflected the internal metamorphosis unfolding as the gods attempted to reconcile identity with loss. Their divinity no longer radiated from a distant star. It emerged from the fragile spark of consciousness shaped by trauma, survival, and introspection. Mortals, witnessing this transformation, began to interpret the gods less as remote forces and more as archetypes of human experience. Inadvertently, the pantheon's decline became the seed of mythologies that would later define civilizations. The keeper encouraged this evolution, asserting that the dissolution of rigid roles was essential for the pantheon's survival. They explained that the gods must cease viewing themselves as extensions of Nibiru's cosmic order and instead embrace the potential for growth rooted in Earth's emergent cycles. This proposal was met with fierce resistance from some, who feared that abandoning their ancestral structures would sever the last connection to their origin. But others perceived a new truth. Their identity could not be preserved by clinging to the past. It must be reconstructed from within, shaped by wisdom rather than resonance. The pantheon's unity began to reform, not as a hierarchical chain of command, but as a network of interdependent beings learning to redefine themselves in a universe that no longer guaranteed cosmic stability. This process of deconstruction revealed hidden tensions long buried beneath divine etiquette. Some gods confessed resentment toward their former roles, admitting that the cosmic order had constrained them. Others revealed envy toward domains perceived as more prestigious on Nibiru. Still others disclosed fear that, without their assigned functions, they might cease to exist altogether. These vulnerabilities, once unthinkable in the age of cosmic certainty, became the raw material from which new bonds emerged. The gods began to see each other as more than roles. They saw personalities, histories, and wounds. The pantheon, stripped of its cosmic scaffolding, encountered itself for the first time as a community. Yet this transformation also revealed a darker truth. Deconstructing the pantheon meant acknowledging that the gods had never been monolithic. Their differences, once balanced by Nibiru's resonance, now surfaced as potential divisions. Some deities began to interpret the collapse as a sign that they were meant to ascend to a higher plane, leaving Earth behind. Others believed they were destined to integrate with humanity, guiding the species toward a future not constrained by cosmic cycles. A few harbored the dangerous notion that the pantheon must impose a new order on Earth, subjugating the planet in compensation for the loss of their world. These conflicting visions threatened to ignite new conflict, threatening the fragile unity needed for survival. The Keeper intervened before these tensions erupted into open war. They proposed a profound shift, that the pantheon should cease defining itself by power and instead embrace purpose. Their roles, they argued, should reflect what they chose to become, not what cosmic forces had once shaped them to be. Purpose would replace function. Wisdom would replace hierarchy. Identity would arise from introspection rather than resonance. This idea, radical and unsettling, created a moment of stillness within the council, a pause in which the gods glimpsed a possibility beyond grief. But even as this new vision took shape, a painful realization lingered. The truths they sought about Nibiru's collapse remained beyond reach. The missing explanation, the hidden mechanism, the deeper meaning, they all lay within a cosmic silence that no reconstruction of the pantheon could penetrate. And this unresolved void became the shadow beneath every step forward. For as the gods slowly redefined themselves, one question remained unanswered. If their identities were no longer bound to Nibiru, then where in the vast architecture of existence did their true origin now reside? The search for that answer would lead them into realms not of the past, but of the stars themselves, toward the cosmic mechanics that governed cycles older than any world they had ever known. The redefinition of the pantheon brought stabilization to the council, but it did nothing to resolve the question now looming largest in their collective consciousness. What forces governed the cosmic cycles that had shaped their rise and collapse? If Nibiru's death was not an isolated tragedy but part of a greater celestial pattern, then understanding that pattern was essential, not only for their survival, but for making sense of their place in a universe suddenly stripped of familiar structure. Thus began the most ambitious intellectual endeavor in their history, the reconstruction of cosmic mechanics. The gods, once content to rely on ancient knowledge inherited from their forebears, now turned toward the stars with new urgency, not as rulers confirming the expected rhythm of creation, but as seekers probing the unknown. They were no longer attempting to preserve an identity. They were attempting to decode reality itself. The earliest efforts focused on the remnants of Nibiru's resonance, those faint, flickering traces lingering in Earth's magnetic field, and in the energetic distortions recorded after the cataclysm. The astronomer priests worked tirelessly beside their divine mentors, mapping fluctuations across continents and comparing them with ancient measurements. What emerged was unsettling. The resonance did not simply fade. It oscillated, as though fragments of Nibiru's collapse continued to move through the cosmic lattice in predictable, rhythmic waves. These oscillations hinted at a deeper structure, a matrix of interconnected forces in which every world, star, and dimension played a role. Nibiru had not been unique. It had been part of a larger system. Its collapse was not random. It was one event in a sequence woven into the architecture of the universe. The Keeper of Secrets took the lead in interpreting these findings. They drew upon forbidden archives and knowledge whispered across epochs, assembling a model of creation that transcended anything the Council had previously understood. According to the Keeper, the universe operated through cycles of expansion and contraction, emergence and dissolution. Worlds like Nibiru were not merely planets. They were nodal anchors in a vast grid of cosmic resonance. These nodes stabilized entire regions of space, regulating energy flows that sustained life, consciousness, and even the formation of myths. When a node collapsed, the grid shifted, altering the forces that shaped reality. The gods realized that their world had not simply died. Its loss had reshaped the cosmic environment itself, placing them in a universe fundamentally different from the one they had known. To test these ideas, the gods constructed new instruments on Earth, blending ancient technologies with innovations inspired by the Keeper's teachings. They erected towers aligned with planetary conjunctions, built subterranean chambers designed to amplify faint cosmic vibrations, and installed crystalline arrays atop mountains where Earth's energetic grid converged. Humans, unaware of the deeper purpose, remembered these structures as sacred sites, observatories, temples, or places where heaven and earth met. But for the gods, they were laboratories of cosmic inquiry. Through these experiments, they discovered that Earth itself resonated with the cosmic lattice, not passively but actively. Its energies fluctuated in cycles far longer than any human age, suggesting that the planet had survived and adapted to previous cosmic shifts. Earth had its own history within the grid, one far older than human civilization. This revelation shook the gods more deeply than the collapse of Nibiru. If Earth was part of an ancient pattern of cosmic cycles, then their arrival had not been an intrusion, but a convergence. They were not merely refugees. They were participants in a transformation that the universe itself had set into motion. Some gods embraced this idea, finding solace in the notion that their tragedy had purpose. Others recoiled, unwilling to believe that their world's death was anything but senseless loss. And yet the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Earth's geological layers recorded previous cataclysms eerily similar to the one Nibiru's collapse had produced. Its magnetic reversals followed rhythms that aligned with cosmic oscillations the Keeper identified. Even its mythic traditions, preserved among early cultures, contained echoes of cycles older than the gods themselves. Still, one question haunted the council. If the universe was governed by such cycles, could Nibiru's collapse have been predicted? Or worse, prevented? The Keeper insisted that the cycles were inevitable, that no being, no matter how advanced, could halt the forces shaping creation. But the traditionalists refused to accept this. They demanded answers with growing intensity, probing deeper into the cosmic mechanics for signs of error, anomaly, or interference. Their investigations led them to a chilling possibility. Nibiru's decline had not followed the expected trajectory of cosmic dissolution. There were irregularities, distortions in the resonance pattern that suggested an external influence. Something had interacted with the node, accelerating its collapse. Whether this influence was natural, intentional, or part of an even larger cycle remained unclear, but the implication was unmistakable. Nibiru had not died peacefully. It had been disrupted. This discovery ignited a new wave of fear among the gods. If an unknown force could destabilize a node as powerful as Nibiru, then no world was truly secure. The council debated the possibility of cosmic predators, dimensional interference, or fluctuations in the deeper fabric of reality. Some feared that the collapse was the first in a chain reaction, that other nodal worlds would soon follow. The Keeper cautioned against speculation, urging the council to focus on understanding rather than fear. But the seed had been planted, and its roots spread quickly. For the first time since the collapse, the gods faced a threat not from their past, but from their potential future. Yet amid the anxiety, a profound truth emerged from their analyses. Earth, though vulnerable, possessed unusual resilience. Its energy grid adapted quickly to the cosmic shift, rebalancing itself through mechanisms the gods had never observed on Nibiru. Its life forms evolved rapidly, absorbing the environmental changes triggered by the resonance resonance wave. Even its mythologies transformed in response to the altered sky, preserving cosmic memory through symbolic narratives. This adaptability suggested that Earth might serve not merely as a refuge, but as a foundation for a new kind of cosmic harmony, one that did not rely on the rigid cycles of nodal worlds. The gods, once defined by the predictable mechanics of their homeworld, now found themselves in a universe shaped by fluidity, transformation, and resilience. Their understanding of divinity, once tethered to cosmic precision, began to evolve. They realized that survival in this new age required abandoning old assumptions and embracing the unpredictable rhythms of a universe in continual motion. But even as they adapted, one question lingered like a distant echo. If cosmic cycles governed the rise and fall of worlds, what cycle awaited them next? And would the unknown force that hastened Nibiru's collapse one day reach Earth as well? The search for this answer would carry the gods and humanity into a confrontation with theories and mysteries that blended ancient memory with the emerging science of a world trying to rebuild itself from the ashes of cosmic loss. The deeper the gods delved into the cosmic mechanics revealed by the Keeper, the more urgently humanity began crafting its own explanations for the upheaval that had reshaped the world. As Earth stabilized after the resonance waves, surviving cultures sought meaning in the devastation, interpreting the gods' diminished presence as part of a greater narrative. These interpretations, rooted in awe, fear, and memory, became the earliest seeds of alternative theories that would echo across millennia. Long before modern scholars debated lost civilizations or forbidden knowledge, ancient humans stood in the shadow of beings who themselves struggled to understand the forces that had undone their origin. In that twilight, myth and observation fused, giving rise to explanations that, while symbolic, carried fragments of forgotten truth. These theories, scattered across continents, were humanity's attempt to map the invisible scars left by Nibiru's fall. One of the earliest reinterpretations emerged from the survivors who witnessed the gods' frantic efforts during the cataclysm. They remembered luminous figures battling storms that tore cities apart, raising barriers of energy that flickered like dying suns. Unable to grasp the cosmic mechanics at play, they concluded that the gods were fighting celestial adversaries, forces of darkness or rival pantheons seeking to overthrow them. This belief crystallized into myths of divine wars, accounts of battles waged in the heavens that mirrored the internal conflicts dividing the pantheon. Though metaphoric, these myths preserved a core truth. The gods had been struggling not against external armies, but against the collapse of their own cosmic foundation. Humanity's interpretation transformed this existential crisis into a drama of cosmic warfare, preserving in story what could not be preserved in memory. Another theory took shape among cultures living far from the great cities, communities who had experienced the cataclysm through environmental chaos rather than direct contact with the gods. To them, the upheaval appeared as a reset, a cleansing event sent by unseen forces to purge the world of corruption. They believed the gods had caused the disaster, either intentionally or through negligence, and that humanity's survival represented a second chance. This worldview framed the gods not as victims of cosmic collapse, but as powerful beings whose moral failures had triggered divine punishment. Over time, this interpretation hardened into doctrines of cycles, ages of rising civilization followed by age-ending floods, fires, or winters. These cycles, found in myths from the Andes to the Indus, are echoes of the cosmic oscillations the Keeper had revealed, refracted through the lens of human experience. As generations passed, a third theory emerged, one born from careful observation rather than mythic symbolism. Priests in rebuilt cities began noticing that certain structures erected by the gods still hummed faintly with energy, aligning with celestial movements even centuries after the cataclysm. They recorded these anomalies with meticulous curiosity, tracking patterns that suggested the gods had not merely reacted to cosmic collapse, but had attempted to embed knowledge within Earth's architecture. This realization gave rise to the belief that hidden wisdom lay beneath temples, mountains, and ruins, messages left by divine beings who foresaw their own decline. These early proto-archaeologists developed rituals and calendars based on the lingering harmonics of the structures, unknowingly preserving a distorted reflection of the gods' final experiments. Their theories that ancient monuments held keys to understanding the universe would resurface thousands of years later in the speculation of modern seekers. Yet the most profound reinterpretation emerged from cultures that had interacted closely with the Keeper. They remembered not a god of thunder or famine, but a figure who taught them to observe the world with both reverence and skepticism. These humans developed the idea that the gods were not eternal beings, but travelers, advanced entities who had come from another realm and whose power depended on forces not fully understood. This perspective, radical for its time, recast the gods as vulnerable, mortal in their own way, subject to laws beyond their control. It suggested that divinity was not a birthright, but a state of knowledge, one that could be expanded or diminished according to the rhythms of the cosmos. This theory, though suppressed by later priesthoods, survived in fragmented traditions across deserts and highlands, influencing secret societies and esoteric schools for millennia to come. As humanity constructed these theories, the gods watched with a mixture of grief and recognition. They saw in the stories reflections of their own confusion, their own attempts to make sense of a universe that had betrayed their expectations. The alternative explanations humans crafted were not simply projections, they were vital attempts to anchor meaning in a world that had nearly been extinguished. The gods began to realize that humanity, in its myth-making, was mirroring the very process the pantheon had undergone in its deconstruction, interpreting loss through story, filling voids with symbolic coherence when literal truth lay beyond comprehension. This parallel humbled the gods. It showed them that humanity carried within it the same impulse that drove the Keeper's quests, the same yearning for understanding that had propelled their own cosmic investigations. But these human theories also revealed something else, something the gods had overlooked. The stories preserved details the pantheon had forgotten or never fully seen. Patterns in the sky, changes in the land, shifts in consciousness that accompanied the resonance waves. Humans, though limited in power, had been sensitive witnesses to the collapse. Their interpretations, while symbolic, contained embedded data the gods had missed in the chaos. The council began analyzing these myths as records rather than metaphors, discovering in them clues about the unknown force that had accelerated Nibiru's decline. Some stories spoke of a devourer star, others of a shadow wind, others of an unseen presence that moved silently across the heavens. These descriptions, once dismissed as superstition, now aligned disturbingly with the irregularities detected in the cosmic lattice. Humanity had preserved fragments of a truth the gods themselves had overlooked. This realization changed the dynamic between gods and mortals. The pantheon, once teachers, now became students, listening to stories, studying ritual patterns, and learning from human memory as they refined their theories about the collapse. The Keeper encouraged this exchange, insisting that the path forward required weaving together divine knowledge and human insight. For in the emerging theories, a larger mystery was taking shape. If Nibiru's collapse had been accelerated by an external force, then that force had touched Earth as well, and humanity, in its myths and legends, had inadvertently recorded its imprint. As the gods and humans pieced together this composite understanding, one unsettling question emerged. Had the collapse been a singular event, or the first echo of a cycle still unfolding? The theories hinted at continuation, at forces still moving through the cosmos with slow, implacable purpose. If true, then both gods and humans stood not at the end of a story, but at the threshold of a new and far more complex epoch, one in which their intertwined destinies would be tested again. And so the search for truth deepened, pulling them toward the disciplines of observation, reason, and science. fields of knowledge that would soon challenge even the keeper's understanding, pushing the next chapter toward a confrontation between mythic memory and the emerging precision of newly awakened human inquiry. The composite understanding woven from divine inquiry and human memory brought the pantheon to a threshold that neither myth nor ritual could cross. To move forward, they needed to confront their crisis through disciplines that had once belonged exclusively to the physical world, disciplines that humans were only beginning to cultivate and that the gods themselves had never fully embraced outside the lens of cosmic resonance. This shift marked the birth of a new investigative era, one in which geology, physics, and early forms of empirical observation became essential to deciphering what remained hidden behind Nibiru's catastrophic fall. The gods, who had long relied on the intuitive harmonics of their ancestral world, now found themselves forced to re-examine reality through the lens of Earth's natural laws. It was a humbling transformation, the first time they acknowledged that their ancient knowledge, though vast, was incomplete. The first clues arose from Earth's restless geology. In the years following the resonance waves, the planet exhibited symptoms that exceeded normal tectonic behavior. Mountains that had stood silent for millennia erupted without warning. Fault lines diverged in patterns too synchronized to be random. The gods recognized these geological signatures from a distant memory. They resembled the initial disturbances that had foreshadowed Nibiru's decline. If Earth was responding in ways parallel to their homeworld's early symptoms, then the collapse might not have been confined to a single node in the cosmic lattice. It might have been part of a larger destabilization affecting multiple worlds. To test this theory, the gods collaborated with human scholars to record seismic activity across continents, marking fluctuations over long spans of time. These early records, etched into stone and clay, would become the foundation of Earth's geological sciences. But to the gods, they were not academic documents. They were diagnostic tools. Physics, too, became indispensable. The gods constructed instruments capable of measuring changes in magnetic fields, gravitational inconsistencies, and atmospheric shifts. These devices, while cloaked in symbolic ornamentation to mask their true purpose from uninitiated humans, represented some of the most sophisticated technology ever implemented on Earth after Nibiru's fall. They detected anomalies that aligned uncomfortably with the distortions that had preceded the resonance surge. Magnetic poles drifted with erratic acceleration. Gravity fluctuated by fractions so small no human could perceive them, yet significant enough to unsettle the gods. These readings suggested that Earth was still experiencing aftershocks of the cosmic collapse, ripples spreading through space-time long after the event had concluded. The keeper warned that these fluctuations should not be ignored. If left unaddressed, they could accumulate, potentially triggering secondary disturbances centuries or even millennia later. Archaeology, still in its infancy among humans, became another unexpected ally. The gods instructed their chosen scholars to excavate layers of earth untouched since before the cataclysm, seeking evidence of how the planet had responded to previous cosmic cycles. What they found astonished even the pantheon. Beneath flood sediments and volcanic deposits lay remnants of civilizations erased long before the gods had arrived. Megalithic constructions, scorched landscapes, and tools of unknown design. These discoveries confirmed what the keeper had long suspected. Earth had experienced cyclical resets long before humanity existed. The collapse of Nibiru had not introduced devastation, but repeated it. The planet had been shaped by cosmic forces across epochs too vast even for the gods to trace. This realization forced the pantheon to question their assumption that they were the first advanced beings to interact with Earth. Evidence suggested otherwise. They were participants in a continuum of rise, collapse, and rebirth. But the most sobering revelation came from studying the atmosphere. In the wake of the resonance wave, chemical signatures in the upper layers of the sky revealed isotopic anomalies, inconsistent with terrestrial processes. These anomalies appeared to be remnants of cosmic radiation emitted during Nibiru's collapse, but they carried a pattern the gods did not recognize, a signature not of natural cosmic decay, but of interference. Whether this interference was the acceleration of the collapse or merely a byproduct, it introduced a chilling possibility. An external force had left its imprint not only on Nibiru, but on Earth itself. The pantheon debated this finding at length. Some gods argued that the anomaly was evidence of a cosmic predator, an entity feeding on nodal worlds across the lattice. Others insisted it was the result of a higher dimensional shift, a natural but violent rearrangement of cosmic architecture. The keeper cautioned that speculation would lead them astray. What mattered was recognizing that Earth was now part of a larger field of altered physics. As scientific inquiry deepened, humanity contributed insights the gods had not anticipated. Observers along coastlines documented tides behaving oddly, rising and falling with rhythms unconnected to lunar cycles. Desert cultures recorded fluctuations in temperature patterns that defied seasonal expectations. Mountain tribes observed stars shifting in ways imperceptible to lower elevations. These data points, assembled across regions, revealed a global pattern. Earth was adapting dynamically, absorbing cosmic shock through mechanisms the gods had never encountered on Nibiru. This adaptability fascinated the pantheon. It suggested that Earth possessed inherent resilience, perhaps the result of surviving previous cosmic cycles, that allowed it to absorb and redistribute energy in ways that stabilized the biosphere. The gods realized they were studying not only the aftermath of a cosmic tragedy, but the blueprint of survival. This scientific counterbalance brought clarity to myths that had once seemed metaphorical. Tales of cycles, world ages, and destructions followed by rebirth now appeared less symbolic and more historical. Geological evidence aligned with flood myths, atmospheric shifts aligned with stories of darkened skies, magnetic anomalies aligned with legends of wandering stars. Humanity, in its intuitive myth-making, had preserved empirical data long before the language of science existed. The gods began to see myth and science not as competing frameworks, but as two perspectives on the same cosmic reality, one encoded through narrative, the other through measurement. Yet amid these revelations, a deeper unease settled upon the council. If Earth had endured previous cosmic cycles, then what pattern awaited it next? And more urgently, were the gods themselves influencing the planet's natural resilience or disrupting it? Their presence, their technologies, even their attempts to stabilize their own fading resonance might be altering Earth's delicate equilibrium. The keeper warned that interference could create imbalances the planet would correct violently. This caution sparked a new wave of introspection among the pantheon. They had once shaped worlds confidently, certain of their role in cosmic order. But now, in the wake of collapse, they felt the weight of responsibility differently. They were not merely guardians, they were variables in a system far more complex than they had ever understood. In the face of geological upheaval, atmospheric anomalies, and lingering cosmic distortions, the gods began to accept a truth that bridged myth and science. The universe was not a static order, but a living system, evolving through cycles of creation, destruction, and adaptation. Their place within it was no longer guaranteed by resonance or lineage. It had to be earned through understanding. And that understanding would soon force them to confront the final question of their fading epoch. If Earth was adapting to a new cosmic configuration, how should the gods themselves adapt? For the growing body of scientific evidence pointed toward a destiny neither divine nor mortal, but something entirely new, something that would redefine the nature of civilization for both gods and humans as they stepped into the uncertain horizon of a post-Nibiru universe. The scientific revelations that reshaped the gods' understanding of the universe also illuminated a truth they had long resisted. Earth was not merely their refuge, it was becoming the cradle of a new civilization, one that would inherit fragments of knowledge, memory, and resonance from a world that no longer existed. As the cosmic dust settled and the tremors of Nibiru's collapse faded into distant echoes, the pantheon confronted the final transformation awaiting them. They were no longer custodians of a cosmic empire. They were the last living witnesses of a vanished age, burdened with the responsibility of transmitting a legacy without overwhelming the fragile species destined to carry it forward. This realization marked the beginning of the lost civilization hypothesis, a paradigm that would guide their remaining centuries on Earth and echo through myths, monuments, and mysteries long after their presence had receded from human perception. The Keeper was the first to articulate what others only sensed, that the fall of Nibiru was not the end of their story, but the beginning of another cycle. Civilizations rise, collapse, and seed the foundations of future worlds. Nibiru had risen across epochs unimaginable to mortals. Its collapse had nearly erased its memory, but the gods themselves, survivors shaped by trauma and tempered by loss, were now vessels of continuity. They carried within them knowledge that transcended architecture, physics, and cosmology. They carried the memory of how a civilization endured its own unraveling. And it was this memory, more than any technology or artifact, that humanity would unconsciously inherit. The Keeper argued that the pantheon must consolidate their knowledge into forms humanity could one day rediscover, not direct instruction, which risked dependence or distortion, but encoded wisdom, monuments aligned with celestial cycles, myths containing mathematical ratios, artifacts capable of sparking questions that would guide future explorers. Many gods resisted at first, grieving the loss of their former glory. They could not imagine transferring their legacy to beings whose lifespans flickered like sparks. But as Earth stabilized and humanity rebuilt its shattered settlements, the gods witnessed a pattern that reminded them of their own distant past. Humans adapted with astonishing speed, forging new cultures, cultivating new lands, and embedding memories of the cataclysm into rituals meant to preserve communal identity. The pantheon saw in these efforts the faint outline of a trajectory they once followed, a species learning to understand itself through struggle. Gradually, resistance softened into recognition. Humanity was not a lesser form of life. It was a younger expression of the cosmic impulse toward survival and meaning. The gods realized that their role was no longer to rule, but to mentor indirectly, shaping the conditions that would allow humanity's potential to flourish. Thus began the construction of the great knowledge repositories, structures later civilizations would call megaliths, ziggurats, pyramids, observatories, and sacred temples. Each site was built upon the principles of cosmic resonance, harmonizing Earth's natural energies with the remnants of Nibiru's encoded frequencies. These structures served multiple purposes. Some anchored stability in regions still trembling from post-cataclysmic stress. Others preserved mathematical and astronomical knowledge essential for tracking long cycles. Still others encoded symbolic narratives containing fragments of the gods' history. Translated into motifs humanity could one day interpret through intuition or scholarship. The pantheon understood that direct explanations would dissolve across generations, but symbols endure, ratios endure, alignments endure. Through these, the memory of a world lost to cosmic collapse would persist in whispers carried by stone. The gods also began transferring knowledge into humanity itself, not through forced instruction, but through selective guidance. They taught writing systems that preserved myth and measurement simultaneously. They encouraged the development of agriculture and settlement patterns that reflected celestial principles. They inspired early philosophies rooted in the interplay between between the seen and unseen. And in rare moments, they formed bonds with individual humans who possessed unusual sensitivity to cosmic rhythms, visionaries, builders, astronomers, and storytellers who would become conduits for fragments of the lost civilization's essence. These humans, later deified or mythologized, carried the seeds of memory into future ages, their insights surfacing in traditions that seem to transcend the boundaries of their era. Yet even as the gods worked to plant these seeds, their presence faded. The collapse of Nibiru had severed the energetic tether that sustained their vitality. Their powers, once radiant and effortless, now required tremendous exertion. Their bodies, long stabilized by celestial resonance, grew heavier, more dependent on Earth's rhythms. The Pantheon realized they could not remain in visible form indefinitely. Their continued presence risked disrupting Earth's natural energetic balance, which had begun adapting to the new cosmic configuration. The Keeper warned that the planet's resilience depended on allowing cycles to unfold without divine interference. If the gods clung too tightly to physical existence, they might hinder the emergence of the very civilization meant to preserve their legacy. The decision to withdraw from public life was gradual, marked by a series of quiet departures remembered in myth as ascensions, vanishings, or returns to the sky. But in truth, the gods did not depart into distant realms. They transitioned into subtler forms of existence, less physical, more symbolic, woven into the cultural, energetic, and subconscious layers of humanity. Their presence persisted in dreams, in intuition, in moments of inspiration that sparked leaps in understanding. They became archetypes, not by choice, but by necessity, living on in the structures they built and the stories they shaped. Their physical decline became the birth of their mythic immortality. Over time, humanity forgot the literal truth of their presence, preserving only echoes in stories of golden ages, sky gods, and civilizations destroyed by cosmic wrath. But the knowledge they embedded remained alive, resurfacing in cycles, as geometry in ancient architecture, as astronomical precision in pre-modern cultures, as myths containing ratios of orbital periods, as philosophical systems pondering the interplay of creation and destruction. These fragments, scattered across the world, became the foundation of the lost civilization hypothesis, the idea that a forgotten epoch of knowledge preceded recorded history, leaving behind clues that modern minds continue to unravel. And yet, beneath all preserved memory lies a deeper truth the gods carried into their quiet retreat, that humanity was not merely inheriting their past, but continuing a cosmic cycle older than both species. The collapse of Nibiru had not ended their story. It had transformed it, weaving their legacy into the destiny of a world poised to rise from the ashes of catastrophe. But one final transformation remained, not for Earth, not for humanity, but for the gods themselves. A shift in consciousness waiting to ignite, a new understanding of identity and purpose forged in the crucible of cosmic loss. That awakening, the deepest secret within the fall of Nibiru, now approached, pulling the Pantheon toward the reflections that would define the closing chapter of their long journey. The final transformation did not arrive with thunder, brilliance, or the flare of celestial signs. It unfolded quietly in the reflective stillness that followed centuries of turmoil. The gods, once radiant embodiments of cosmic order, now moved through a world that no longer echoed their former power. Their temples stood complete, their knowledge encoded, their legacy placed gently into the hands of a young species destined to rise beyond the boundaries of myth. Yet in this twilight of divine presence, a realization dawned that none among the Pantheon had anticipated. The collapse of Nibiru had not merely stripped them of their origin, it had revealed a truth long concealed beneath the grandeur of their cosmic heritage, one that reshaped their understanding of existence with profound, humbling clarity. The truth was simple, startling, and transformative. The source of their divinity had never resided solely in their world. It had lived within them all along. This awakening began as a whisper, an inner stirring that flickered within the keeper and spread slowly through the ranks of the pantheon. Freed from the resonance cycles that had once defined their identities, the gods found themselves tapping into a different kind of strength, one not anchored in cosmic harmonics, but in consciousness itself. Their thoughts, emotions, and reflections became the new terrain of discovery. The grief they had carried, the questions that haunted them, the humility born from witnessing cosmic impermanence, all of it coalesced into a form of awareness untouched by the collapse. They realized that divinity was not the product of their world's unique orbit or energetic field. It was the capacity to learn, adapt, create, and evolve. It was the ability to perceive meaning within chaos, to rebuild identity from fragments, to search for understanding even when the universe offered no certainty. The fall of Nibiru had stripped away the scaffolding of their former existence, revealing an inner realm far more powerful and enduring. As this realization spread, the pantheon experienced a shift more profound than any cosmic cycle. They began to see their long history not as a sequence of decrees and rituals, but as a journey of consciousness, awakening slowly across epochs. Their roles as lords of storms, waters, knowledge, and creation were no longer external functions. They were internal archetypes, reflections of aspects within themselves that had been shaped, not determined, by cosmic resonance. The gods understood that they had never been fixed beings. They had always been evolving, even when blinded by the stability of their ancestral world. In this newfound clarity, they recognized that their greatest failure had not been losing Nibiru. It had been believing that their identity depended on it. Humanity, unknowingly mirroring this revelation, continued to rebuild and reinterpret the world through myth, story, and inquiry. As human cultures flourished, they carried within them faint echoes of the gods' awakening, the belief that knowledge could be pursued for its own sake, that consciousness could expand through reflection, that identity could evolve beyond inherited roles. Civilizations that rose in the centuries after the cataclysm, Sumerians, Egyptians, Indus cultures, early Andean societies, constructed cosmologies that placed human beings in dialogue with the universe rather than beneath it. This shift was not merely cultural. It was the unfolding of the very legacy the gods had hoped to inspire, a species capable of discovering the hidden architecture of existence not through divine command, but through inner illumination. The pantheon watched this emergence with awe. They saw humanity chart the stars, develop mathematics, construct monumental architecture, and preserve stories that contained symbolic keys to cosmic truth. They saw patterns of consciousness evolving in parallel with technological and cultural growth. At times, they guided subtly, through dreams, intuitions, or synchronicities that nudged human minds toward discovery. But increasingly, the gods found themselves stepping back, recognizing that humanity's evolution required independence. They understood that their previous methods, direct intervention, hierarchical instruction, cosmic authority, no longer served the new era. A different path had opened, one in which humanity and the gods shared a common journey rather than a stratified divide. This recognition led the pantheon to embrace their final metamorphosis. They no longer sought to influence the physical world through power. Instead, they began dissolving into the realm of archetype and consciousness, becoming part of the vast psychic reservoir that shapes intuition, creativity, and insight. Their presence, though no longer visible, became interwoven with the inner worlds of those who searched for meaning. In this transformation, the gods discovered a form of immortality far more resilient than the cycles of any planet, the immortality of ideas, symbols, and awakening consciousness. They realized that a civilization does not survive through structures or technologies alone, but through the evolution of understanding. As the last remnants of their physical forms faded into myth, the gods gathered one final time, not in a council chamber of stone and metal, but in a shared field of awareness shaped by the collective resonance of their experiences. In this realm beyond form, they reflected on their journey, the rise of Nibiru, the long arc of cosmic harmony, the tragedy of collapse, the cataclysmic transformation on Earth, and the awakening that had followed. They understood that existence was not a cycle of certainty, but an unfolding of possibility. Every loss carried the seed of a new beginning. Every collapse opened a door to deeper understanding. The universe was not a fixed order, but a living question, one that invited all conscious beings, divine or mortal, to participate in its ongoing creation. From this collective reflection emerged a final message, one not spoken, but carried forward in the quiet evolution of humanity, that the greatest secret of the gods is not power, knowledge, or cosmic origin. It is the recognition that consciousness is the true engine of civilization, capable of transcending worlds, cycles, and even time. The gods had discovered this truth only when everything else was stripped away. Humanity, inheriting both their ruins and their wisdom, now stood poised to discover it anew. And so the story ends where all cosmic stories begin, not in certainty, but in awakening. Nibiru was gone. The gods had transformed. Humanity walked its own path beneath a sky no longer shaped by divine intervention, yet still illuminated by the echoes of ancient memory. The legacy of the lost world lived on not in the stars, but in the human capacity to imagine, to question, to create. For in the quiet spaces of thought and dream, where myth meets inquiry and memory becomes possibility, the essence of the Anunnaki endures, whispering that the fall of a world is never the end of the story, but the threshold of what consciousness might yet become.